So these voter forums are presented by the League of Women Voters of Bellingham and Whatcom County and by the City of Bellingham. Whatcom County has provided our facilities here, and the forum is recorded by BTV 10. So these forums will be repeated on BTV 10 until the November 6 election, and they're also available to view on demand on the city's YouTube channel and on the League's website, and I believe also on the low-powered radio stations KMRE and KAVZ. So thank you to the Bellingham Herald, who are our media partners, and we thank all of our other partners for their generous support. If you have the opportunity, please thank them as well, particularly the people doing the hard work here on the recording. So the League of Women Voters was founded in 1920. We're a non-partisan organization with 800 affiliates across the country. The League encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase the understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League never endorses candidates or political parties. Our membership is open to men and women of all ages, and we invite you all to join us if you aren't already a member. There are brochures at the back, I believe, that can explain the benefits of joining the League and how you can join us. We'd love to have you. So about today's forum, this is the first of 4 forums produced this month by the Bellingham-Whatcom County League. This is always a busy month for us. We do this every year. Today is devoted to the Bellingham Home Fund and the other Washington state ballot initiatives. So that is 1639, changes to gun ownership and purchase requirements. 1634, prohibit local taxes on groceries. 1631, carbon emissions fee measure. And 1940, law enforcement and police training. So that's today. Wednesday evening, we'll feature the Washington State Court of Appeals judge candidates, the Whatcom County Prosecuting Attorney candidates, the PUD Commissioner, and Whatcom County Council at-large candidates forum. Then next Saturday, we'll be at Ferndale High School, and that will feature candidates for the 42nd Legislative District, the representative positions 1 and 2, and the 42nd District State Senator, as well as the 1st Congressional District Representative. So we hope you'll join us there as well. And our final debate in October is on Wednesday the 24th. It'll be here in the County Council chambers, and that will be the 40th Legislative District Representatives, positions 1 and 2, and the 2nd Congressional District. That evening will begin with an informal conversation with some of the candidates from 6 to 7. So we usually run the forums where there are races where candidates are opposed or there is some competition. The details of all these forums, I'm sure you'll have seen the several notices in the Bellingham Herald. They're also available on our website. And just to note that these forums are the property of the League of Women Voters of Bellingham-Whatcom County and of the City of Bellingham. So they may not be used in any manner without specific written permission from both parties. So that was the very serious stuff. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the first forum, which is about the Bellingham Home Levy Fund. So Karen Funston, who's our other co-president here, will moderate this discussion. And I'll leave it to Karen to explain how we're going to run the discussion today. Thank you.
Up on the podium today is Greg Winters, who is the Executive Director of the Opportunity Council. And Mr. Winters will be speaking on behalf of the housing levy. There is no organized opposition, so he will be the only one speaking this morning. I'm going to start by reading you the summary of it, and it's long and it has details in it, so I'm just getting you prepared for that. Proposition 2018-5, Low-Income Housing Levy. The City of Bellingham Council adopted resolution number 2018-09 concerning property taxes for low-income housing and related services. This proposition would replace and enhance existing levies to fund housing and housing services for people with low or very low incomes by authorizing 1, a property tax increase of 12 cents per thousand in assessed valuation to $2.25 per thousand for collection in 2019 through 2028. The 2019 amount would be used to complete the limitations for subsequent levies for collection in 2020 to 2028. And 2, regular property tax levy of up to 24 cents per thousand under RCW 8452-105 for each 10 years, together for generating $4 million annually. Should this proposition be approved, yes or no? That's the summary of the levy that we'll be voting on. So today, Mr. Winter is going to start by giving us an opening statement of up to 5 minutes from the Home Fund Levy campaign. And then I will take questions from the audience. We have people that are available to pick up, and we have, I'm not sure where they are. In the back, they're waving their arms there, and we have cards. You write your questions on the cards. We have a screening committee that is looking at them for handwriting. If I can't read it, I can't ask it. For duplication, and also for something that's absolutely inappropriate might be eliminated. But other than that, we will take your questions and intermix them with questions that our League Question Forum Committee has come up with. So after that, I will be reading questions, and Mr. Winter will have 1 minute to respond. Carol Como and Judy Hopkinson are they're sitting down here. They are going to be tracking the time. Oh, I see I jumped ahead on the script. And they will flash a yellow sign when there are 15 seconds remain, and a red sign when the signal time is up. If the speaker goes past the signal time, a bell will be rung to signal stop talking now. So the audience is encouraged to write their questions and give them to the ushers. And our league members, James Freudenberger and Jean Carmian, will be screening them. And without any further, we'll ask all the questions that we have that time permits. And I will announce when the last question is about to be asked. Because of our filming, we try to keep very closely to our timing on this. So, thank you.
Time to go?
Time to go.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for and all of your volunteers for all that you do to inform voters of Whatcom County. It's just a great service. I'm Greg Winter. I live in the York neighborhood of Bellingham. Excuse me. During the day, I'm Executive Director of Opportunity Council, but I'm coming to you here today as co-chair of the Bellingham Home Fund campaign. I'm just curious, how many of you are Bellingham voters? And keep your hands up. How many of you weren't raised here but moved here from somewhere else? Wow. How many people were raised here? All right. Like many of you, I moved here to improve the quality of my life. I landed on a couch in the York neighborhood until a room opened up in that house where I was crashing. Rent was cheap, and in just a few years, I managed to buy a 4-bedroom home in the same neighborhood for $140,000. Boy, those were the days. Not long after I moved here, my first friend in Bellingham, Seth Fleetwood, he recruited me to do some door-to-door canvassing for the Greenways levy. It was the first Greenways levy renewal campaign in 1997, and that was a real eye-opening experience for me. I saw my new community coming together as neighbors to make an investment in the long-term health and vibrancy of their community and its residents, and I thought, that's really cool and pretty smart. The Bellingham Home Fund is similarly conceived. 6 years ago, when the Bellingham Home Fund first appeared on the ballot, voters agreed with these compelling beliefs. 1, everyone should have the opportunity to live in a safe, healthy, affordable home. 2, working families, veterans, seniors, people with disabilities ought to be able to afford a decent place to live and still have the basics for things like groceries and gas and childcare. 3, children's success in school and in life begins when families can afford a stable, decent place to live. And finally, it's better for society and the environment when people can afford to live close to where they work. And in 2012, a strong majority of voters said yes to the Bellingham Home Fund. Those voters will be pleased to know that since 2012, in just 6 years, the Home Fund has more than met its goals, producing and preserving hundreds of units of quality housing, serving the target populations, very low-income seniors, veterans, people with disabilities, and working families, prioritizing families with the lowest incomes, and attracting significant amounts of public and private matching dollars. Judging by a recent survey, Bellingham residents still agree that housing is a top priority. Western Center for Economic and Business Research found that housing affordability and homelessness are ranked as the 2 top challenges facing the city by residents of Bellingham. While the Home Fund isn't going to solve all the city's housing problems, it's already accomplished so much. Since 2012, each dollar of the Home Fund has been matched by $8 of private, state, and federal funds. It's building and preserving over 700 affordable homes for very low-income seniors, veterans, people with disabilities, and working families, and 5,000 of our neighbors have been helped with housing support services and rent assistance. One such individual, for example, is John, not his real name. He's a 68-year-old man who is chronically homeless living on the streets of Bellingham. John has a case of severe Parkinson's disease, and he needed a hip replacement. But the surgeon was hesitant to proceed with the procedure because John lacked a stable place to recover. John was in pain, and the physicians were frustrated that they couldn't provide the care that they knew he needed. The happy ending to John's story is he's now living relatively pain-free in an apartment building that was recently built with support from the Bellingham Home Fund. Life isn't perfect for John still, but he hasn't been to the emergency department or been hospitalized since securing a place to live. So that's a great example of why the largest sector of our campaign endorsements this time around is the healthcare sector. The hospital, clinics, and even health insurance companies are endorsing the campaign. And John's is just one of hundreds of stories of lives transformed by housing and support services made possible by the Home Fund. Francis Place, for example, is providing supportive housing services to previously homeless veterans and both young and older adults with disabilities. Via Santa Fe on Bakerview Road provides homes for very low-income working families with children. The Home Fund recently supported a major renovation of downtown's Mount Baker apartments and made many of the apartments permanently affordable for very low-income residents. Wait, did that say 15 seconds already? For 5 minutes? Whoa. Well, I think I'll deal with the rest with questions.
Okay, the first question. How will approving the Bellingham Home Fund levy impact homelessness in the city?
A great question. While the Home Fund isn't solely focused on homelessness, many of the investments that have been made so far and that we expect to come from projects in the future do focus on homelessness. So for example, one project I didn't mention is Opportunity Council's own project in partnership with Northwest Youth Services called 22 North. It's that new building on State Street next to Chuck's Midtown Motors. And that's going to have 40 apartment units dedicated to people who are homeless. Again, a mixture of veterans, young adults, and older chronically homeless adults with disabilities. And we expect more projects like that in the future to help address homelessness. In addition to that, things like our homeless outreach team are in part paid for by the Bellingham Home Fund.
This is a two-part question. What has been accomplished with the Bellingham Home Fund levy monies that were approved in 2012? And what are the goals for the next 4 years?
Thanks. I'm gonna look at my notes just so I. The Home Fund so far has produced over 500 new or preserved units of housing, and there's over 700 units committed that are yet to be built with the current Home Fund program. Also, as I mentioned, 5,000 residents have been helped with some type of housing service, either rent assistance, eviction prevention, or supportive services from the Home Fund. The coming program that's on the ballot is slated to produce almost 600 additional units of housing, either in preservation or new construction, and assist 3,000 people, 50 low-income home buyers, and a land acquisition fund for future development.
Next question. Explain how the expenditures in the home fund are managed, who is overseeing our investments, and how can the public provide input?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think the city of Bellingham has done really a masterful job of administering this fund. So it's administered by the city's planning department and overseen by an oversight board, the Community Development Advisory Board, which is made of citizens that include representatives from the business community, from Western Washington University, from human service providers, and other sectors. So they have oversight over how the funds are invested and managed. And the city has an administration and financing plan that's in draft form that helps put together the guidelines, sets out the guidelines of the program, and that's available on the city's website.
Next question. What main problems come up in subsidized housing?
What main problems come up? Well, there are problems associated with, I think, our country's and our state's underinvestment in housing. We have, as much as you can discern a national housing policy in this country by our budget and where the resources, federal resources flow, it's really concentrated on home ownership subsidies for very wealthy people. And that may come as a surprise to you, but if you look at the federal budget, that's really where it's at. So the main problems with subsidized housing is there just is not enough resource for the needs. You know, rents have been skyrocketing. Since the levy was passed in 2012, a two-bedroom apartment is 44% more expensive than 6 years ago, for example. So to me, the problem is there's just not enough public investment.
In the future, what proportion of affordable single-family homes and what proportion of small units for single adults or seniors will be needed?
So the question is about the proportion of units of housing. I'm assuming that the questioner is thinking about the entire housing stock. You know, if you think about the unaffordability for people even at median incomes, you know, I would argue, and some people might think this is crazy, that you know, we should probably have something on the order of 50% of our housing that is in some kind of public or nonprofit management, because you know the way things are going, wages are just not keeping track. You know, I mentioned earlier that rental housing prices have been rising at 40+% just over the last 6 years. And we know that wages have not come anywhere near that amount. So we're going to need a massive investment in public housing.
What proportion of the fund goes to provide emergency rent assistance, and what proportion is used for long-term housing investment?
The long-term housing investment in terms of bricks and mortar in the ballot measure that's before voters this year is something on the order of 60%. I don't have that table in front of me. For supportive service and rent assistance, it's you know, close to probably about 30, maybe a little less than 30%. And then there's 5% for affordable home ownership, and then a small amount for that opportunity fund for land acquisition for future development. 6% is set aside for administering the program, which I think is really a great bargain.
Your website states that leveraging money comes from the federal low-income housing tax credits and the Washington State Housing Trust Fund. Do you anticipate that Bellingham can continue to receive adequate funds from these resources? If not, how will we achieve the goals for future development?
Well, it's precisely because we have the Bellingham Home Fund that we've been successful in attracting those dollars to our community. In fact, you know, I've been working with communities around the state that are trying to emulate what we're doing. Since the Bellingham Home Fund was passed, the city of Vancouver, Washington passed a similar measure in 2016. I've been talking to people in Spokane. San Juan County has a ballot measure on the ballot this fall. City of Ellensburg and City of Olympia passed measures last year. So, you know, communities around the state are realizing that to attract this kind of matching investment from the tax credit program, the Washington State Housing Trust Fund, you have to have local commitment.
How does the number of units created, and I assume the questioner here means created by the funds in the levy, compare to the number of individual and families or families needing assistance?
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, we're not expecting that the home fund is going to solve all of the city's housing problems. But it is helping, as I mentioned earlier, literally thousands of Bellingham residents. The number of people who need assistance is really a moving target, and there's a lot of different ways to measure it. We know from our annual homeless census that at any point in time, we have something on the order of 700 to 800 people who are living in our city without a place to live. But that, like I said, it's a moving target. And as we gain more resources to address the issues of homelessness and housing affordability, we know that in the past we've been able to impact those numbers. But the way the housing market's been performing lately, it's really an uphill battle. But without this, we would be so much further behind.
This will be the last question. Describe the programs that are providing assistance to low-income buyers to purchase their home.
Yeah, I'm proud that I was one of 3 co-founders of the Culshan Community Land Trust, which is just a great program. That program, and I'll just mention another example, Habitat for Humanity, those organizations work together. And the really terrific thing about the home ownership assistance provided by the Home Fund is that it's used in a shared equity model where the first-time low-income home buyer agrees to a limited amount of appreciation so that when they sell their home and move into the conventional home ownership market, the home that they're leaving behind is set at an affordable price for the next low-income buyer. So that's in a nutshell the way that program works.
Thank you. That concludes our forum for this Proposition 2018-5, the Low Income Housing Levy. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Karen and Greg, for that very informative forum. So the next up is our debate, which will actually be, the pro and con statements will be presented by the members of the Bellingham United debate team. The moderator will be Karen Funston again. So I will let Karen explain to you how this forum will run and what the procedures are for taking questions. Karen, can I hand to you to also introduce Laura and the team? Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. We are very excited to have members of the Bellingham United Debate Club with us this morning. And to explain a little bit about their program and what we're doing this morning is Laura Livingston, their coach and mentor.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting us. We appreciate the opportunity to show you what our teams can do. I would like to recognize a few people in the audience who have been instrumental in making our team great. One of them is Jennifer Johnson, who is one of our public forum coaches. She's been doing this as her 3rd year now. And the other is Ian McCurdy, who is a local attorney who has been working with us for the past year. And they're both inspirational to students because they're not elderly like me, so the kids can kind of relate to them. And also, they're young enough but involved enough in careers in life that they can provide valuable assistance to kids. Finally, I'd like to recognize Dr. Linda Miller, who is the Bellingham High School principal. She has been very supportive of us, and in fact, Bellingham High School is what hosts our team when we practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'd like to introduce, first of all, our debaters. First, speaking on the pro side, Paige Sensale, who is a senior at Whatcom High School and is in her 2nd year of debate. Next, Joey Jeffers, who is a junior at Bellingham High School and in her 2nd year of debate. Thirdly, I'm going to start with Spencer Rose over there because Spencer has been with us for 4 years, yes. And finally, I would like to introduce Tom, and in the hairiness of the moment, I have forgotten, of course, your last name because I knew this would happen to me. It's Tom Cassella, who has been with us for 2 years. And Tom has been very enthusiastic. He's been to debate camp for both of the summers that he was involved in debate. And we're looking forward to a great year next year when Tom and Joey are both seniors. One of the things I want to make clear to people is that just because people are debating on a side, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a position or belief that they espouse. It's really important to understand this because in understanding this, you'll understand some of the value of high school debate. There isn't any other activity that shows kids how to look at a topic, how to analyze the most important parts of that topic, how to research evidence to support both sides, and then how to get up and argue persuasively for or against the topic. That is probably the blessing and the curse of debate, because now I feel compelled whenever I hear any public statement about any major topic is to think to myself, well, okay, I believe this, but what would the other side say? And it's an important aspect of our democracy, the ability to analyze both sides of a proposition and to be able to marshal evidence and make persuasive arguments. One of the things that's also really important about debate is that it teaches people how to communicate. No matter what you do in your life, whether you're a welder or a chemistry professor or an astronaut or an attorney, you will be spending your life communicating with people. Whether it's communicating information or arguing in favor of something you believe or persuading someone that your point of view in your business or your profession has got more merit than the opposing view. Kids who learn how to speak in public have more self-confidence and a better ability to communicate so that when they're against a kid that hasn't debated, and there's, you know, a fine line between which person would be chosen for a position or which person's points of view would tend to be more favored, the debater is probably always going to win every time because of that self-confidence and because of that ability to marshal arguments and be persuasive. When Karen introduced the Bellingham United Debate Club, I don't want you to think they're just 4 people. No. We have 7 novice debaters and a lot of our open debaters down at Kamiak High School in Mukilteo. And right now, as we're speaking, our poor, innocent, defenseless novice debaters are in their very first debate rounds, which is like very exciting and very terrifying. And they were kind of torn because on one hand, they wanted to be here, but on the other hand, they recognize how important it is to get a good start in your debate year. Lest you think that what we do is weird or odd and you've never heard of us before, let me throw out a few familiar names. Has anybody here ever heard of Justice Sonia Sotomayor? Have you ever heard of Jane Pauley? Ever heard of Stephen Colbert? Brad Pitt? Renee Zellweger? Glenn Greenwald? The famous journalist, the one that has broken so many stories having to do with privacy invasions? All of those people had one thing in common, and that was in high school, they were members of speech and debate. Each year in the United States, literally hundreds of thousands of kids in public schools and in private schools, kids who belong to the National Forensics League, the Catholic Forensics League, the National Christian Forensics League, they all compete in tournaments all over the country. Sometimes when we have really big tournaments, there are 700 or 800 kids at a tournament. Think about that. If there were 700 or 800 football players at a tournament, you would bet that somebody would cover it. Finally, I want to ask you to take one of our flyers in the back, go to our website, visit us, and if you think you can support us, please make a generous financial donation because we are dependent primarily on donations. Thank you very much.
So while they're getting set up there, I will give you the summary of the initiative and explain how this debate is going to proceed. So first I will read you the summary of I-1639. This measure would require increased background checks, firearm safety training, and waiting periods for semi-automatic assault rifles before semi-automatic assault rifles may be purchased or delivered. It would impose age limitations on who may purchase or possess certain firearms, including prohibiting purchases by persons under age 21. It would require certain secured firearm storage or trigger locks and criminalize non-compliant firearm storage if it results in unauthorized use. It would enact other firearm-related requirements, including certain warnings, record keepings, and fees. This morning, our speakers will share their views on whether this whether or not this measure should be approved. Before we begin, let me just explain. This is a hybrid of what the students are normally used to doing in their debate competitions and what the league normally does in terms of our format for initiative debates. Each team will have 4 minutes per speaker for an opening statement and give their best reasons for approving or rejecting the measure. There will be 4-minute rebuttal, and then there will be a cross-questioning where each team will be given time to question the other team. Then each team will be given a 2-minute closing and final focus time. The speakers will then respond to questions from the audience in the same format that we used earlier, where if you have questions, write them on the index cards available. We have ushers that are picking them up, and they'll bring them up to our screeners who will be checking for legibility and clarity and to avoid duplication. Our timers are, once again, Carol Como and Judy Hopkinson. And they will be tracking time. They will flash a yellow sign. This is for the speakers. They'll flash a yellow sign when there are 15 seconds remaining and a red sign to signal when time is up. If the bell rings, 15. Do you want 30 instead of 15? 30. Oh, thank you. And then they'll ring the bell when the time is completely over and you need to stop talking. Directions for the audience. Fostering civil discussion is an important goal of the League. To that end, we ask that those in the audience be respectful and refrain from comments during the forum. Also, please hold your applause until the conclusion of the program. If you have questions, put them on the index cards and they will be passed forward, and I always make audience questions a priority over the questions that the League has come up with in the event that we don't get questions from the audience. Our pro team is Paige Sensale, and she will go first, and then I will rotate in the speaker's order. Are you ready?
Yep.
Ms. Sensale, you may start with your 4-minute opening statement.
My partner and I affirm the resolution resolve it is in Washington State's best interest to pass ballot Initiative 1639. Contention 1. Initiative 1639 enforces gun responsibility of buyers and sellers. Subpoint A. Regulations deter criminals. Under Initiative 1639, layers of bureaucracy will be instilled to ensure the dealer understands who they are making a gun purchase to. In addition to the current background checks, the dealer must be notified by the chief of police or the sheriff to determine if the purchaser is eligible to possess a pistol or a semi-auto assault rifle. Once a criminal history has been examined, the following can cause a delay or ineligibility for up to 30 days or more. Open/pending criminal charges, pending criminal commitment proceedings, an outstanding warrant, or an arrest. What this means is that people with criminal records are prevented and deterred from obtaining a firearm. Subpoint B, waiting periods prevent death. After the dealer receives a clean background check, they must wait 10 business days to deliver a weapon to the purchaser. A recent Harvard study shows that a cooling off period between the sale and delivery of a gun can reduce impulsive and anger-driven violence. Between 1970 and 2014, 43 states and Washington, D.C. had waiting period laws in place for at least a year. The researchers compared guns per capita homicide rates in states with and without the law and over the same time periods. States with mandatory waits had an average of 17% fewer murders and about 10% fewer suicides. By contrast, research from the American Journal of Public Health showed that when South Dakota repealed its 48-hour waiting period for handgun purchases in 2009, overall suicides the following year increased by 7.6%. Forcing people to wait during their emotional state will prevent others and themselves from deadly shootings. Subpoint C, firearm safety promotes responsibility of owners. Initiative 1639 requires all purchasers to complete firearm safety training within 5 years of buying a gun. Lessons include basic firearm safety rules concerning storage and children, firearms and suicide prevention, and state and federal firearms laws. Think of it as driver's ed for your gun. We require car owners to become competent in the ownership of their potentially deadly vehicle. Owning a gun should be no different. Contention 2, this initiative would control minors' access to guns, thus significantly decreasing suicides and accidental deaths. Subpoint A, secure gun storage laws would prevent accidental shootings. According to the Institute for Public Health in 2017, there was an average of 4 deaths a week due to accidental shootings. More than a third included victims 18 years or younger, for a total of 1,208 accidental deaths. This serious problem would be effectively addressed through this initiative, through the gun safety provided by this initiative, and be incredibly useful as preventative measures. This initiative would require persons to ensure that they store their weapons in a secure place to prevent negligence and death. Failure to do so, resulting in harm, will lead to a Class C felony. This would provide accountability for anyone not practicing gun safety. The U.S. General Accounting Office stated that 31% of accidental deaths would have been prevented through this measure. Subpoint B, secure gun storage laws would prevent suicides. The Gifford Law Center said that among teens living in homes with guns, roughly 40% of those who had serious risk factors for suicide, such as recent depression or suicidal thoughts, and roughly 40% of those who had attempted suicide in the past year, reported having easy access to the guns in their homes. This source also states that using evidence from the Gun Violence Archive that between 2004 and 2014, over 6,000 minors intentionally shot themselves. The vast majority of them used guns owned by someone in their home. The U.S. National Library of Medicine said the kind of secure gun storage law this initiative would provide is both the most logical way to reduce suicide rates, which makes up more than half of all suicides, according to the CDC. Okay.
Mr. Rose, your 4-minute opening statement, please.
My partner and I negate the resolution resolved. It is in Washington State's best interest to pass the ballot initiative 1639. Contention 1, this initiative is ineffective without federal implementation. Subpoint A, background checks that already exist are extensive enough. Washington State already requires background checks. According to current state law proposed by Initiative 594 in 2013, all firearms sales or transfers in Washington, including by dealers online at gun shows and between private persons, are subject to background checks unless specifically exempted. Virtually all retail and wholesale arms dealers require background checks, and expanding those checks does nothing to guarantee additional safety to citizens, particularly without a federally implemented mandate. Currently, federal law already requires dealers to perform background checks on prospective purchasers. Enacting laws that are stricter than the mandate have little chance of succeeding if neighboring states do not also enact these stricter guidelines. Subpoint B, the vast majority of guns used in violent crimes are not purchased legally and are thus unaffected by this initiative. Most guns used in crime are actually acquired illegally. According to a study by the University of Chicago, only 2.9% of guns in violent crimes in Chicago were purchased through legal means. That means 97% of guns used to commit crimes were purchased on the black market or through illegal transport. Furthermore, evidence indicates that unless surrounding states such as Idaho, Montana, and Oregon also enact stricter gun laws, which is highly unlikely, implementing restrictions on such a small scale will prove useless. Evidence for this is ample. Despite Washington, D.C. banning handguns in its district, according to the Daily Caller, nearly 80% of all homicides were committed with a gun. That number actually went down after the handgun ban was ruled unconstitutional. Moreover, most of these guns were actually acquired by gang members through illegal means, which included the transportation of guns from neighboring states with more lax purchasing requirements. If action is taken merely at the state level, we will not see a significant decrease in gun violence, as those who intend to use guns for their crimes will still be easily able to do so by simply driving out of the state or purchasing a weapon via the internet. As Barack Obama said in 2016, a violent felon can buy a gun over the internet with no background check, no questions asked. Subpoint C, this initiative supports the rise of the black market. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, guns are routinely trafficked from states with weak regulations, subverting strong gun control regulation in states like New York. Not only are there several loopholes to this initiative, but there are many connotations to the way criminals could work around this legislation. In an interview with Forbes, 3 representatives of the ATF looked over the availability of black market guns. Agent Mullum and the 2 other agents, John Curtis and Jason Zamoloff, all weighed in and agreed there is no precise formula for what handguns go for on the street, but basically guns are so readily available, the black market price is typically just a few $100s more than retail. Because of this, we can expect an increase in black market sales if this legislation passes, because guns will be harder to buy legally. As Ozzie Nezevich, the current Spokane County Sheriff, stated recently, as long as you have the black market where people can buy firearms, the gun checks are only for those of us who are good, honest, law-abiding citizens. This initiative cannot prevent crimes effectively and will only prove to hinder responsible gun owners. Contention 2, Initiative 1639 isn't economically viable. Due to lack of revenue from in-state gun sales and the increased spending this initiative will inevitably cost, this initiative is going to be expensive, and this legislation has no way to cover this lost money. A previous gun tax introduced in Seattle was overestimated by almost 50%. When City Councilmember Tim Burgess proposed the tax, he said the city's budget office had estimated it would raise $300,000 to $500,000 a year, according to the Seattle Times. During its first year, the firearms and ammunition tax payments received by the city were less than $200,000. If this is any indication, the cost of this initiative may outweigh the revenue it generates. Furthermore, as we've shown, the black market sales of guns are likely to increase, meaning local law enforcement agencies will have to increase to spending to combat this problem. The bottom line is this initiative costs both gun owners and all taxpayers too much money without a guarantee that it will be able to, in the end, pay its costs. And for these reasons, we urge a ballot in the negation.
Thank you. And now for the rebuttal round. Ms. Jeffers, you have 4 minutes for your rebuttal.
Okay, so the first thing that I would like to bring up about their case is that it only really focuses on background checks. However, there are many other aspects of this initiative. As we bring up in our case, there are age requirements, there are waiting periods, there are secure gun storage laws, and therefore focusing only really on background checks and the negative effects on background checks completely disregards the other aspects of the initiative. Another argument I would like to make is that one of the things that they themselves brought up is this initiative isn't implementing a background check where none exists. It is simply extending current regulations. Therefore, even if they were to prove that the current background checks laws in Washington State to be harmful, and they would logically have to provide evidence from Washington State, given that, again, we already have certain background check laws, even then, it wouldn't be an effective argument against this initiative, because this initiative would not be the cause of these problems. A previous initiative, Initiative 594, would. Another thing that I would like to bring up is that their Contention 1 tagline is, "This initiative is ineffective without federal implementation." But again, they only really use evidence from the ineffectiveness of background checks, and not necessarily from other aspects of this initiative, and therefore claiming that an entire initiative is ineffective simply because of one section of it is not a logical argument to make. In their subpoint A, their argument is that we already have extensive enough implementation. However, they don't provide any evidence or statistics proving that it is enough from current Washington State laws, and therefore this is an unsubstantiated claim that should not be taken as a valid argument. In their Contention 1 subpoint B, they make the point. Their point is that most guns used in violent crimes are purchased illegally, and they use the examples of Chicago and DC. However, Chicago and DC are not representative of guns used in violent crimes because these are two famously crime-ridden areas and are not representative of the entirety of the U.S. And certainly not of Washington State, and therefore aren't logical pieces of evidence to use. They bring up the statistic 2.9%, where 2.9% of guns used in crimes in Chicago are purchased legally. However, one thing I would like to make clear, we're not saying that this initiative is going to completely get rid of crime. We're not saying that this initiative is going to completely stop all criminals from getting guns. However, the point is to reduce the amount of crime, to reduce the amount of criminals getting their hands on guns. So even if 2.9% were applied to Washington State, if we can stop 2.9% of people killing themselves, 2.9% of accidental shootings, 2.9% of homicides, then this initiative is worth it and worth implementing, and it is doing its job. In their subpoint C, they talk about the black market and how, I believe one of the quotes that they use is that prices are only a few $100s over retail price. However, I would like to point out hundreds of dollars is still a much higher price, and therefore assuming that all people will simply turn to the black market is not a logical conclusion to make, because not everyone can afford hundreds of dollars more for a gun. And another thing that I would like to point out is that in this statistic, in this subpoint, they also use statistics from Chicago and DC. In their Contention 2, they talk about how this is not economically viable. However, they did not provide an estimated cost of the initiative. And they also used a statistic, I believe, from Seattle, where they overestimated revenue by 50%. But I would also like to point out that there's a big difference between the funding that Seattle has, which is a city, and the entirety of Washington State. Washington State's annual spending is about $41 billion, and throwing away an initiative that could save hundreds of lives simply because of logistics is not viable. Thank you.
Mr. Cassella, your 4-minute rebuttal, please.
Starting with my opponent's first contention, they mentioned that this initiative will promote responsible gun ownership and they will end up deterring crime as a result. This is fundamentally untrue, as the black market will, without a doubt, increase in size and activity. If someone wants to get a gun, they will. That's a plain and simple truth. They also mentioned that anyone with a criminal record will be barred from purchasing a firearm. That means 80% of inner-city minority males are barred from the right of self-defense in areas ridden with crime. According to writer and civil rights activist Michelle Alexander, up to 80% of minority males in inner cities have criminal records. Since universal background checks, which the affirmative wishes to enforce, restrict access to firearms to those with criminal records, up to 80% of inner city minorities, many who suffer from only minor infractions, become defenseless, susceptible to theft, muggings, and murder. According to Jacobs and Furr of the New York School of Law, it's not realistic to consider all persons ever convicted of a felony or a domestic violence misdemeanor as forever posing a significant risk of misusing a firearm. Background checks only further the vast range of collateral consequences that make it difficult for ex-offenders to reintegrate into society. The large majority of people with a felony conviction were not convicted of a gun crime. If you do your time in prison, that should not mean that you don't have a right to defend yourself in the real world. If you do your time, the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. versus Heller case solidified the understanding of the Second Amendment that people are permitted to own a gun for their own self-defense. Moving on to their subpoint B, my opponents mentioned that waiting periods will ultimately lead to less gun deaths, and they told an example of a one-year implementation over the majority of the country. Not only is this a nearly national implementation, as my partner and I mentioned in our case, as a more ideal solution, but it's also simply over the course of 1 year, which cannot prove that there won't be ways found around the legislation through the black market through interstate commerce. Guns will still be in circulation regardless, so violent crimes will still persist until a fully national implementation is introduced. The same claim can be used for their third subpoint, which references a gun safety course through this initiative. Illegal gun purchases, as we said, account for 97% of gun violence in Chicago. So there's no way that gun violence can be stopped through a gun safety course because those would only account for legal purchases of guns. They mentioned in their second contention that suicides will diminish through the use of trigger locks. However, suicides do not only happen in cases with minors. Many people who could be considered responsible gun owners have committed suicide with their own guns. A trigger lock cannot stop that. If a teenager were to know their parents' code to their trigger lock, there's nothing stopping them from committing a suicide with a gun in their home. Moving on to the points we made in our case, in our first contention, my partners and I mentioned that neighboring states have significantly more lax laws, meaning that those willing to bring guns into Washington will be able to do so. As I mentioned, 97% of gun violence in Chicago happens with illegal firearms due to the fact that Illinois has very strict gun laws compared to surrounding states. My opponent's response to this was that even if it's 3% of legal purchases, this legislation is going to be worth it to save any number of lives. However, this legislation is more costly than I think my opponents realize. Don't let the security theater bog you down. If 80% of inner city minorities are defenseless in their own homes and a vast increase of black market activity is to be expected, we're talking about ruining far more lives than through infiltration of low-income communities and leaving these people with no means of protection and corrupting their neighborhoods with a heightened black market presence. My opponents claim that there is no comparison between Chicago and D.C. to Washington State. That's completely untrue. There are plenty of low-income crime sects of the state that could see harsh results of this initiative. Not only this, but as a voter, you will see the effects of this legislation due to the gap in funding for law enforcement to counter the black market growth, as well as lost revenue and gun purchases inside the state. My partner and I urge a ballot in the negation for these reasons. Thank you.
The debaters will now have 3 minutes for grand crossfire questions. This is a freestyle question, questions from where each team questions the other team. Begin now.
How does 1639 hurt responsible gun owners?
So basically, any law-abiding citizen looking to purchase a gun already has to go through the system of Washington's background checks, at least in Washington State. Extending these checks impacts the people in question by subjecting them to more invasive and extensive searches, all while anyone who knows they won't pass a background check will still be easily able to purchase a gun illegally. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So in your second contention, you're talking about accountability if somebody were to take the gun that was securely stored under the guidelines of the initiative, correct?
Yep.
So basically, if someone were to take your gun while you were following all of the guidelines proposed, wouldn't you still be held accountable for any felony committed with it?
I'm glad you brought this up, Spencer, because logistics like this will be sorted out through legislation if this initiative gets passed. Because in order for this initiative to be passed, things like this will be sorted out through our legislators. And also, if you can't provide any statistics or any proof showing the frequency of this occurring, then this shouldn't even be an argument.
Okay.
Going back to your point concerning possible racial discrimination, with the use of background checks. If you do believe that there is such an inherent problem within the U.S. justice system, why are you advocating for federal implementation?
So we aren't advocating for federal implementation as a way to solve our country's issue of racism. We're simply saying that allowing this initiative to pass only makes our inherently racist system able to continue to disenfranchise minorities, especially in Washington's inner cities. So when minority males are incarcerated at a much higher rate for much lower charges, they're held to a lot lower of a standard.
But isn't the problem with the judicial system not the background checks themselves?
The problem is with the judicial system, but allowing this initiative to pass only allows this inherently racist problem to carry out its problems.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How will these firearm safety courses be funded?
So again, logistics like this are usually sorted out by lawmakers after an initiative has been passed. However, the initiative itself already lists possible sponsors, sponsor meanings, possible hosts and or sources of funding. For example, there could be a nationally recognized organization on firearm safety training. There could be universities or colleges. And these are all examples. This is all theoretical. And again, just because there are logistics to sort out, that does not logically mean that an initiative like this shouldn't be passed.
Can we have the next question? Okay. Are you aware that under current laws, a purchase across state lines of firearms by a Washington resident must be legal under both state requirements?
Regardless of what's legal over in the conversation of crossing state lines, it's significantly easier to bring guns over to Washington illegally if surrounding states do not have as strict gun laws.
Thank you. Now we'll have 2-minute closing statements. Ms. Cassella, please give your 2-minute statement.
With all things being equal, Initiative 1639 is legislation that will keep your family, your community, and yourself safe while still being able to exercise your constitutional rights. The biggest argument my opponents are making against us today is that 1639 will increase the black market, yet they have no real proof of this occurring. Their evidence that 97% of guns used to commit crimes are bought illegally are from Chicago, a crime-ridden city. They also use statistics from DC, another crime-ridden place. Unless they can prove statistics about the black market occurring today in Washington state or increasing within time, they have no argument in this debate. Moving on to our case, Initiative 1639 is more than just background checks. There are 4 main parts within this. Number 1, it requires the chief of police to give the okay of a purchase of a gun in order to detect criminal charges. Number 2, the longer waiting periods provide a cooling off time to deter impulsive and anger-driven violence. And you can see this in our statistics that we said earlier, because a waiting period has states that 17% fewer murders and 10% fewer suicides. Third, the firearm safety training promotes responsible gun owners, and these trainings would be provided by professionals. And number 4, a secure gun storage deters accidental shootings and devastating suicides among minors, because it reduces easily access to the guns in their home, and it promotes responsibility to the owner, because failure to do so results in a Class C felony. If you are a responsible gun owner, Initiative 1639 harms you in no way. In fact, you should be proud of this initiative. I need you to vote yes on your ballot in November for Initiative 1639, because to make Washington State the example and set precedent of what it means to keep yourselves, your community, and yourself safe while still exercising your Second Amendment right and saving the most amount of lives possible. Thank you.
Mr. Rose, your 2-minute closing statement, please.
As we stand in opposition to this initiative, it is important to realize that our side is not attempting to neglect the issue of gun violence that plagues our country. The constant struggle with gun violence in our country is a massive issue, but we stand here today to say that in the grand process of mending our problems, this initiative is not sufficient enough in its benefits and is a waste of Washington State's time and money. I'll begin by touching on the effectiveness of this initiative's proposed changes. As we have already stated in our case, Washington already has a system of background checks and essentially has since 2013. Extending our system of background checks, as this initiative proposes, is completely unnecessary if surrounding states will not do the same. As we've seen in the example of Illinois and Washington, D.C., implementing increased forms of background checks and gun control as a concept does not work unless it is mutually agreed upon by a large area. In the status quo, if any person in Washington state wants to buy a gun, whether it be for malicious intent or not, they will be able to, and none of the proposed guidelines of the initiative will change this. In fact, extending the process that a person must carry out to buy a gun in this example will only support the rise of Washington's inner city black markets, therefore leaving thousands of people without a way to defend themselves. Guns will still be in the general circulation of Washington's markets, and anyone attempting to use a gun maliciously will be able to fairly easily. Statistically speaking, we can expect an increase in black market sales if this legislation passes because guns will be harder to buy legally. Simply speaking, this initiative is simply too broad, situational, and inconsistent to be considered in the best interest of Washington state. Loopholes and changes in the basic policy of Washington's gun policies can result in people being held accountable for crimes they did not commit, even while they were following the extensive guidelines proposed. All of my opponents' proposed arguments and effects may or may not be as effective as they allude to, but under the guidelines of Initiative 1639, they will be severely limited and ineffective, all while inhibiting Washington state's law-abiding citizens. In conclusion, for the sake of our state's future and solving our issues surrounding gun violence, we strongly suggest a vote for no on Initiative 1639. Thank you.
Mr. Cassella, please give your 2-minute final focus.
I should-
Is that the wrong?
Yeah,
I'm
you
going
go
first,
I
yes.
wondered about that. Ms. Jeffers, your 2-minute final focus, please.
Okay, so we win this debate today because we prove, undoubtedly, that the benefits of this initiative far outweigh any potential downsides. The first thing that I'd like to bring up is the potentially hundreds of lives that could be saved by this initiative. One of the first things that my opponent brings up, in fact, is my partner brings up, in fact, is waiting periods, which our opponents do not address at all in their constructive. Waiting periods undeniably prevent death. In states that have waiting periods in place, there are 17% fewer murders and 10% fewer suicides. This means that we would undeniably reduce the number of deaths in this country, or in this state. So moving on to our contention 2, we talk about accidental shootings and suicides. Suicides would be further prevented by secure gun storage laws. In our subpoint A, we talk about how secure gun storage laws would prevent accidental shootings. We talk about how there is an average of 4 deaths a week in 2017 due to accidental shootings, making a total of 1,208 accidental deaths. This seriously devastating problem would be addressed through secure gun storage laws provided in this initiative. Because any failure to comply resulting in harm would lead to a Class C felony. We also talk about how suicides and how many teens with risk factors for suicides are in homes with firearms. If we were to store these firearms in a secure location, if we were to require the people store these firearms in a secure location, then we would prevent the death of many, many young people. And because we promote solutions and proactive responses as opposed to simply getting caught up in logistics, I do think that there should be a vote yes on the ballot initiative. Thank you.
And Mr. Cassella, your final focus, 2 minutes, please.
My partner and I have won the ballot in the negation today because at the state level in Washington, this initiative is far too flawed. We'd like to stress that we have no intent to ignore gun violence in the United States, but we have proved that the affirmation has little solvency for the problems they've brought up, and it's important not to overlook what the negation has stated. My opponents have simply been pushing that lives matter more than comfort, but that's not what that this debate is about today. This promotion of security theater will be costly, as innocent people could be taken to jail for crimes they did not commit. 80% of inner-city minorities males are barred from owning a gun. Legally bought guns are very rarely used in crimes, and there's no way to cover the cost of this initiative. By making guns harder to get legally, more people will resort to illegal methods of purchasing, such as the black market, which is made especially easy over interstate borders. Law enforcement will then be working harder to stop this inevitable market increase, which this initiative has no means to pay for. Not only this, but the costs of the black market go beyond financial. The black market can infiltrate neighborhoods and destroy low-income communities that already have a presence of crime. As much as my opponents don't want to admit it, there are people in Washington state who live with this reality, just like in Chicago and DC. If people are expected to have their right to self-defense that the Supreme Court has granted them, then they will be forced to turn to illegal methods or to stay law-abiding citizens just because they've had a prior minor infraction for something that was completely not gun-related. Not only this, but it's a completely infeasible measure because if the chief of police has to record and pass through every single attempt at purchasing a gun, That means that there's going to be a significant backlog in larger cities, like Seattle. So this initiative is far too imperfect to place our trust into for its true lack of effect and its serious downsides. Voters, I urge you to think long and hard about how you will mark your ballots this November, and I appreciate your attendance in this debate today. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I'll be asking questions, and each question will be answered 60 seconds by pro and by con. And we have pre-assigned speakers to answer the questions. If you need to trade, that's fine, but I'm going to follow the assigned order unless I hear otherwise. First question, and this will be pro Ms. Sansale and Mr. Rose Con. As students, you are directly impacted by the threat of school shootings. How has this impacted your opinions on gun legislation?
I believe that with my work within Students for Action, we led the school walkouts during our district among the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting wake. And different school shooters have had such easy access to the guns in their home without their parents being responsible for the crimes that were committed. And with this firearm safety measure implementation of having your guns securely stored at home, things like this could reduce school shooters from ever doing things like this.
Mr. Rose?
I think it's ridiculous to say that action shouldn't be taken at this point. I mean, we seem to be the only country in the world that deals with this problem significantly. I think that there is a lot of legislation that should happen in the means of working towards making gun access a lot more difficult for people. I think I think there's not enough technical action taken to actually make sure that these weapons are less easy to purchase, less easy to actually commit these crimes with. And I think action needs to be taken, but not potentially on the state level.
And the next con will be Mr. Cassella, and pro will be Ms. Jeffers. And it's a little bit of a long question. Some argue that this is not reasonable, that it is not reasonable to be able to vote and enlist in the military, but not to drink alcohol. 639 restricts semi-automatic gun ownership to individuals who are at least 21. Does this make sense given the other responsibilities that those under 21 have in our society? Why or why not? Mr. Cassella.
I think that the conversation of age in this debate is one that I've heard a lot, but it's one of those details that I think people get bogged down in a little bit too much. I think that the fact that at any point someone could own a weapon of war is something that people have to take into consideration regardless of a 3-year gap. And so the age debate is not something I put too much thought into, because I feel like the difference in 3 years is not as significant as people make it seem, and the weapon is the same weapon regardless of your age.
Okay.
Ms. Jeffers?
I actually do have a response to that. So essentially what this initiative is doing is it is making the age requirement for semi-automatic weapons 21. And we found a study done by Rand Analytics where even though there wasn't necessarily a significant difference in school shootings if the age requirement was 18, there was a significant difference when the age requirement was 21. Therefore, for example, if in states where the age requirement is 21, there is an obvious reduction in school shootings and statistical reduction in school shootings. Therefore, saying that this is not a relevant discussion is not necessarily a claim that you want to make, because there have been studies that have shown 21 is better than an age requirement of 18.
Okay, back to pro Ms. Sansale and con Mr. Rose. How will this initiative affect the sale or possession of assault weapons? Ms. Sansale?
So basically what happens is, again, with the age requirement, the Washington State's current law is you can be 18 to purchase an assault rifle, but with under 1639, you have to be 21 to purchase an assault rifle. And the more extensive background checks will ensure that the chief of police and the local jurisdiction doing the background checks will make sure that your criminal history is more concise and a lot, like, with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that things on your record aren't potentially dangerous and could potentially hurt you and others with your purchase of this weapon.
Mr. Rose?
So basically, as Paige was saying, this initiative increases the process that needs to be carried out in terms of background checks. It also increases the age limit of actually purchasing these weapons, which makes sense on the surface level, but it actually really does increase the process to anybody willing to buy these guns perfectly legally, which does make sense, but under this initiative, people will still be able to buy these guns illegally and without these background checks.
Okay, next question, and this one will go to Mr. Cassella and Ms. Jeffers. How will I-1639 prohibit criminals from obtaining illegal firearms? Ms. Jeffers?
Okay, so one thing that I would like to bring up is that, again, we're not saying that this is going to prevent all criminals from getting firearms, but this is going to reduce the number of loopholes. It's going to reduce the number of ways that a criminal can purchase a firearm. With stronger background checks, with waiting periods that would reduce impulsive, anger-driven decisions, and with age requirements, this would prevent, first of all, school shootings due to the age requirements and, of course, the secure gun storage. This would prevent people who make impulsive decisions to buy and use a gun. It would prevent them from purchasing a weapon and becoming a criminal. And obviously, because of background checks, you would prevent people from criminal records from being able to purchase and possess a firearm.
Mr. Cassella?
I think this question's fairly simple. If you're willing to commit a violent crime with a gun, then you're probably willing to get that gun illegally, regardless of restrictions against you. So I don't see this legislation being completely infallible in stopping crime with a gun.
Okay, next question. Back to the original two. Does the initiative have the potential to lead to the prosecution of lawful gun owners?
As I stated in my summary, this initiative, if you're a responsible gun owner, you have nothing to worry about with 1639. If you have a clean background history, if you get the firearm safety training within the last 5 years, if you make sure that you you are doing the waiting period and everything's perfectly lined up, if you're a responsible gun owner, this initiative does nothing but protect you, your family, and your community from violent crimes.
Mr. Rose?
Many of the things proposed in this initiative are positive in their wording, but a lot of its actual changes in laws and phrasing of implementation leads to some different loopholes that actually do impact law-abiding citizens by basically, if they're forced to carry out a lot of different regulations in how they store their gun and how their gun is basically monitored. And if someone were to say, steal their weapon, if they were following all of these guidelines, they would be held accountable for the crime no matter what. And even if this bill passes, this might be worked out in legislation, but these are very pressing issues for the initiative.
Next question. This one is for Mr. Casales and Ms. Jeffers. Several years ago, Australia banned semi-automatic weapons and experienced a decrease in gun violence. Do you think this measure would have a similar effect in Washington, and why or why not? Ms. Jeffers.
I do think it would have a similar effect. There are obviously other factors to take into account. For example, Australia does not have bordering countries, things like that. However, because of the statistics provided in our case, and because obviously the background check laws and the number of different restrictions provided in here, we would definitely see a decrease in violent crime.
Mr. Cassella?
When we debated this topic, a similar topic back in, I think it was November of last year during the regular debate season, this was an argument that came up a lot because, as we mentioned in our actual case, the national implementation of background checks and of gun laws seems to be a lot more sound due to the fact that bordering states can't get guns into states with stricter gun laws because there are no bordering states with laxer gun laws. So the Australia point is one that shows a more I think, a more perfect gun legislation if you're looking for an absolute and total effect of what's going to happen. But in this legislation, it's hard to see that the same effect is going to happen simply because of the geography of the lower scale of what's going to happen in the initiative.
Thank you. Next question. And this will be our next question. Excuse me, this will be our last question. Would you support, I'm sorry, I've got too many pieces of paper going on here. How would the passage of 1639 affect school safety? Ms. Cassella?
Well, I think in regards to just the students I know have their parents who are gun owners, and if there's some sort of safety device, such as a trigger lock, that the dealer would provide or sell to their parents in order to make sure that they would do this, implemented it at home, it would prevent students from acting in impulsive actions and bringing that gun to school. Another thing that would make prevent their or advocate for their parents to actually use the trigger lock safety is the fact that if they don't and their gun is used in some sort of violent crime, they are charged with a Class C felony, and Class C felonies last up from 10 to 40 years.
Mr. Rose?
I think the issue of accountability is going to hold serious impact in terms of our school's safety. However, I think with the changing ideas of this initiative, I think it'll still be very easy to acquire these weapons, and anyone with the malicious intent will still be able to. I can't speak on actual statistics on how this will go down because, as we've stated, weapons will still be very easy to purchase. But I think given the increased focus on accountability, I think it's a step in the right direction to making sure this is less of an issue in the future.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask the audience to join me in thanking our debaters today. They spent a great deal of time preparing for this, and we really appreciate their help and our hard work. Thank you.
All right, welcome back again. I hope you've enjoyed the break and got a couple of minutes of sunshine. There is a slight change now in some of the timing of what will follow here because we have only one speaker for the next forum. Annette Holcomb, who will be our moderator, will explain to you the rules of this forum. But just to let you know, this forum on Initiative 1634 to prohibit local taxes on groceries will run from 11 to 11:15, and then the carbon emissions fee measure will begin at 11:15 and run till 12 p.m. Okay, so just to clarify, some changes to the timing here. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Annette, who will introduce our speaker and explain the rules for this slightly different forum for this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and I'm glad to see all of you here today. Initiative 1634 is one of the 4 state initiatives that will be on your ballot. The proposition on the ballot will say, this measure concerns taxation of certain items intended for human consumption. The measure would prohibit new or increased local taxes, fees, or assessments on raw or processed foods or beverages, with exceptions, or ingredients thereof, unless effective by January 15th, 2018, or generally applicable. Thank you. So in summary, this measure would prohibit new or increased local taxes, fees, or assessments of raw or processed foods, beverages, or their ingredients intended for human consumption. The covered groceries do not include alcoholic beverages, marijuana products, or tobacco. Collection of local sales and use taxes, and of taxes, fees, and assessments of such raw or processed foods or beverages, or any ingredients thereof that were in effect in January 2018 would continue. This measure would not prevent the state from imposing taxes on groceries. Unfortunately, the con speaker for this issue notified us yesterday that he was unable to attend. However, we are pleased that Felicia Heaton is here representing the Yes on I-1634 campaign. This campaign is comprised of more than 1,400 small businesses in Washington, including restaurants, grocers, and more. Felicia is a third-generation Pacific Northwesterner with deep roots in Washington and Oregon. She has a background in print and broadcast and journalism and emergency management. Since we have only one speaker today, we will adjust the format and the time frame. Ms. Heaton will have 4 minutes for an opening statement, and then I will present a statement from the opposition group. Ms. Heaton will then give a 1-minute response to questions from the league and the audience. So again, we have our timers here, Felicia, and they will give you a 15-second warning to let you know that your time is almost up. A stop sign will be displayed when time is up, and if you continue to go on, the bell will ring.
Somebody
Okay.
comes in from the side and tackles me.
So we ask you to be respectful of our time so we can get in as many questions as possible. And to the members of the audience, it's our goal to foster a civil discussion on the issues today, and we encourage you to send your own questions up for the discussion. We also ask that you not clap or audibly cheer during the program, but wait till we're finished with this segment and then do your applause. If you would like to send a question up for our guest, then write it on the cards. We have 2 ushers here circulating with cards. Just raise your hand if you want to send a question up. And again, our screeners will be looking to make sure that they are readable and screening the questions for duplication. So with that aside, let's begin. Timers, are you ready? Okay. Ms. Heaton, you may start with your 4-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for hosting today's forum. We really appreciate the opportunity to tell you about I-1634 and the reasons that we think it's so important. Those main reasons, of course, fairness and affordability. I-1634, the Yes to Affordable Groceries initiative, would ensure that our groceries, the food and beverages that we consume and buy every day, would be protected from any new or increased local tax, fee, or assessment. We learned from the recently enacted Seattle beverage tax that cities and municipalities can impose a tax on both food and beverages through what is called a privilege tax. The Office of the Attorney General refers to this in the explanatory statement that is in the voter's guide that you will be receiving shortly. Seattle used this maneuver to impose its beverage tax, which exposed a loophole in our tax laws that can be applied to all kinds of items. Given that food and beverages are the most essential items in a family's budget, I-1634 would close this loophole and stop local governments from seeking revenue from taxes on groceries. Why is this needed? 2 main reasons. First of all, people from all over the state are battling the rising costs of living. Here in Bellingham and Whatcom County, in Seattle and the Puget Sound, and around the state. While those who have benefited greatly from economic growth may not be hurt by taxes on groceries, those who are living paycheck to paycheck are suffering, and they will be hurt. The United Way recently released a study on those who are facing the sting of higher prices. They have a category called ALICE. That acronym stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. These are families we all know who, despite working full-time, some of them with 2 or more jobs, are still struggling to get by. In Whatcom County, 22% of your more than 84,000 households are in this category. Together with the poverty rate, close to 40% of the families here are struggling to make ends meet. Higher prices on some items in the grocery cart may not hurt the wealthy, but these prices impact the middle class, and they can crush fixed-income families. Next, the issue of fairness. The state of Washington, considered by many to be a progressive leader in the country, has the most regressive tax structure of all the 50 states. It means that the place that we place an unfair burden on those individuals and communities that are least able to afford it. And taxes on food and beverages are the most regressive taxes that can be imposed. Leaving the opportunity open for local governments to impose taxes on these essentials will not only perpetuate this regressive system, it will only make matters worse. It's these pillars of fairness and affordability that have brought diverse organizations and interests together, united in support for 1634, groups that often are opposing on different issues such as labor and agriculture or business and community groups. They've joined together in broad bipartisan support and become a part of this diverse coalition for 1634. Support growing every day with more than 1,400 small businesses. We're talking about independent grocers, restaurants, coffee shops, cafes, food carts, and a whole lot more. They've come together with organizational partners, including the Washington Farm Bureau, the Food Industry and Retail Associations, the Ethnic Chambers of Commerce Coalition in Seattle, the Juice Products Association, the King County NAACP, and a number of other organizations in support of 1634. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Remember that a yes vote on 1634 means no to new taxes on food and beverages.
Thank you. At this time, I will read the statement sent by our con-speaker who was unable to attend today. First, more than a third of American adults are obese, and today's children are already our most overweight generation. The obesity epidemic is directly tied to the rising consumption of sugary drinks. 98% of Initiative 1634's funding comes from the soda industry. Currently, $13 million in total donations from just 5 companies. Taxes on grocery items like meat, produce, bread, and dairy products are already illegal in Washington state. Initiative 1634 is part of a nationwide effort by the soda industry to preempt policymaking and remove local choices for cities and towns. The strategy led by the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, is directly built on the strategy used by the tobacco industry in the 1980s and by the NRA. Initiative 1634 is anti-voter choice and misleads on the effects of soda taxes on consumer choice. Academic studies show that following soda tax implementation, consumers' grocery bills stay the same while they make healthier choices. The vast majority of consumers shop at the same stores in their cities instead of driving to avoid a tax. Taxes on sugary drinks do not impact employment. Data from Pennsylvania's Labor Department following the implementation of Philadelphia's tax on sugary drinks shows new benefit claims made for the beverage-related industries actually decreased by 10% in Philadelphia over the course of 2017. So we will now proceed with the questions that you might have sent up, and you will have 1 minute to respond, Felicia. The first question, Washington State has a long history of allowing local governments to tax the activities that occur in their jurisdiction. What is the rationale of restricting the ability to tax in this narrow category of groceries, but not other goods and services?
The important thing about 1634 is that it is focused on the necessities, the food and beverages that we buy every day. We heard in the statement that there's a concern about loss of local control, and I would say that this initiative does not impact local control. It simply says that there are some items, the basics, the most important things that we put in our shopping carts every day should be off limits. It's been referred to as a privilege tax, the loophole that allows for taxes on food and beverages. And I would say that one of our supporting members, the Washington Farm Bureau, has a saying that they put out all the time, which is that food is a right and not a privilege. And I think that speaks to that concern.
Okay. The next question, doesn't Washington already prohibit taxes on groceries? Isn't this really directed to a potential tax on snack foods and soft drinks? And if so, how is this negative?
It's a myth that that it is against the law to tax food and beverages. This privilege tax allows exactly for that. We've seen that the Seattle beverage tax applies to soda, it applies to juices, it applies to fruit juice, to vegetable juices, anything with added sugar, coffees, teas, kombucha even. And so you can see that starting with this one kind of beverage, this one kind of product isn't actually just one kind. It spreads among many different kinds of products. And when you take a look at that, you take a look at the slippery slope. What's next? And that's a concern that we have that we would like to face with 1634.
The next question is, why does this initiative restrict only local taxes on groceries, but not potential state taxes then?
Again, it speaks to that privilege tax, which allows for these specific jurisdictions to implement taxes on specific items. And that is why that is the reason for this approach.
And you chose not to address the state taxing issue?
Correct.
Okay. The next question is, what is the likely impact of this initiative on public health?
There are studies around the country of taxes on food and beverage items, in particular in Berkeley, California, in Philadelphia and other areas. They've taken a look at how these kinds of taxes impact health, and what they've found is that there is no clear line of impact on public health. It does, in fact, impact, these kinds of taxes do, in fact, impact the pocketbooks of the people who are doing the shopping in the stores. They find themselves having to stretch their dollar even further. The small businesses that provide the jobs and the products that people are buying, they have to find ways to absorb the costs themselves, and those costs end up trickling down to the consumer and to families. That's an impact to public health. If people don't have the funds to make the purchases on the items they need, that's restrictive and impacts their well-being.
This is the last question already.
Asked.
Well, what is the rationale behind treating soda and broccoli the same? The wording states that there should be no taxes on raw or processed foods or beverages. So it's such different things.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the beginning of that question?
What is the rationale behind treating soda and broccoli the same? The wording states there should be no taxes on raw or processed foods or beverages.
I see. Strictly, the language of the initiative is designed to say that no groceries, food or beverages, or the ingredients that we buy to prepare the meals in our own homes should be taxed. And that's why we've listed those particular items as ingredients, as beverages, but not marijuana, not cigarettes, tobacco.
Well, thank you very much for meeting with us today, and I regret that we didn't have a person here for you to debate.
It is a little lonely.
And I want to make it clear that this is why we have just a shorter time devoted to this particular issue. But let's clap for Ms. Heaton. Thank her for making the trip up here.
Thank you, Annette. Our next forum is Initiative 1631, the Carbon Emissions Fee Measure. Karen Funston will again moderate this forum, and she will introduce the speakers and explain the process to you. Thank you. So we've allowed an extra 5 minutes for this because we've made up some time earlier with not having one of the speakers present. So this will run 45 minutes. Okay.
So this next initiative presentation is Washington Initiative 1631, the Carbon Emissions Fee Measure. The proposition on your ballot says, Initiative Measure number 1631 concerns pollution. This measure would charge pollution fees on sources of greenhouse gas pollutants and use the revenue to reduce pollution, promote clean energy, and address climate impacts under oversight of a public board. Should this measure be enacted into law, yes or no? This morning, so the summary of this is, this measure would impose pollution fees on certain large emitters of greenhouse gas pollutants based on rules determining carbon content starting in 2020. A public board would supervise spending the revenues on reducing pollution, promoting clean energy, and addressing climate impacts to the environments and communities. Utilities would receive credits for approved investments. Indian tribes would consult on projects directly impacting their land. There would be periodic reporting on the measure's effectiveness. This morning, our speakers will share their views on whether or not this measure should be approved. And I would like to introduce this morning Steve Gary, who is on behalf of Yes on I-1631, speaking in favor of the proposition, and Billy Wallace, Political Legislative Director, Washington and Northern Idaho District Council of Labor, who is speaking on behalf of No on the 1631 coalition. Yeah, I'll get to that. Each speaker will have 4 minutes for an opening statement and give their best reasons for approving or rejecting the measure. After that, they will have 4 minutes each to rebut, and then 1 minute each for a second rebuttal. We have timers up here, Carol Como and Michelle Kopcha, and they will be tracking the time. Our timers will flash a yellow sign when 15 seconds remain, and a red sign when time is up. If a speaker continues, the bell will be rung for a signal to stop talking now. We ask that everyone be respectful of the time allotted so we can cover as many questions as possible. Fostering civil discussion is important to the League of Women Voters, and to that end, we ask you and those in the audience to be respectful and refrain from comments during the forum, and to hold your applause until the conclusion of the program. We encourage members of the audience to provide questions for the speakers on the index cards that are provided, and ushers are going around and they will pick them up or give you cards if you need cards. Our questions are screened by League members James Freudenberger and Jean Carmian. They're screened for legibility and clarity and to avoid duplications. We also ask each question to both sides. We offer each question to both sides, so no question will be directed only to one side or the other. So our pro speaker, Mr. Gary, will go first.
Thank you so much. For the organizers having us here, the Yes campaign feels that this initiative may be one of the most important choices Washington voters have ever faced. A bit about me. I'm a retired refinery worker. I grew up in Western Washington. My father was a logger. Logging was the first work I've ever done. I went to the University of Washington. I studied life sciences and got a Bachelor of Science degree in the early 70s, but I spent virtually my entire life working as a skilled craftsman, as a machinist in industry, construction, shipbuilding, and then 25 years in the oil refining business. I retired 4 years ago. I spent the last 25 years of my career working for both Shell and Tesoro on Marches Point in Anacortes. I was fortunate enough in my life to spend almost all of it working under union contract. And when I retired, at that time I retired also as local union president, Steelworkers Local in Mount Vernon. I represented refinery operators and maintenance employees of both Shell and Tesoro, as well as a number of other petroleum businesses. And since I've retired, I've worked as a volunteer with the Washington State Blue-Green Alliance. Blue-Green is an organization formed by both the Steelworkers and the Sierra Club, as well as other labor organizations and environmental organizations designed to facilitate a dialogue between labor and environment to help us answer a very significant question that I've been posed my entire working life, and that is whether we can have job creation as well as environmental protection at the same time. Industry has said we cannot. I've always believed it's a false choice. Blue-green is designed to help show that. This policy, 1631, is also designed to address that issue. And it also addressed probably the most important issue of our time, and that is climate reality. Scientists have been telling us for 30 or 40 years that we are on a collision course with a very, very dangerous and tragic future for our children and grandchildren if we don't act, and act soon, to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Polling is encouraging. Over the last several years, we've shown that in virtually every county in Washington State, even the most conservative counties in eastern Washington, a majority, sometimes a significant majority of voters understand that the climate reality harm is real, global warming is real, and we must do something about it. But we have lacked the will to act, and we have lacked an understanding of how best to act, to resolve, to address this problem. 1631 was designed, it was written and developed by the widest coalition of like-minded organizations I've ever been part of. Virtually every aspect, every community, every constituent group in this state came together over the past 4 or 5 years to develop this policy. It is, in fact, designed to help us answer this conundrum between jobs and environment, to deal with climate reality, and to do so in a fair, effective, and manageable way. It means emission reductions, it means job protections where necessary, and it means real job growth and economic growth that we need in all corners of Washington State. There is an economic impact study that was done by the University of Massachusetts at Amherst that has very, very favorable results and gives us every reason to believe that this effective and manageable policy can be implemented and achieve its goals. I believe I'd like to get into the dialogue, so I'll close with this. I really think that this issue poses to the voters in Washington State an ethics test, a morality test. We can't afford to fail this test. The consequences are simply too great. Thank you.
Mr. Wallace, your 4-minute opening statement, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Like she said, my name is Billy Wallace. I'm with the Washington Northern Idaho District Council of Laborers, and I am the political and legislative director there. I want to start out by saying the laborers and the Washington building trades in general are not climate deniers. We've been working on solutions for this for the last few years. We pushed hard on ST3 down south. We want light rail. We want mass transit. Going forward, this is going to be higher prices on fuel for everybody. This is for us, it's a regressive tax for our members. I'm a member of Local 292 out of Everett, and our members work out of that local. And we have everything from the Snohomish-King County line all the way to the Canadian border. We have 7 locals around the state. 6 of them are construction locals. Our members over in Eastern Washington have to drive even farther. They take these jobs knowing that they're going to go wherever the work's at. When they show up, they know they're going to be working themselves out of a job the first day they show up, but they have to get there every single day. 95% of them don't have the opportunity to use mass transit. They have to drive there because the work is all over the state. This will not be passed, this will be passed down to them. This is going to be a pass-through, and it's going to hurt our members. If this was a fair tax, we would be more on board. For us, it's not. It hits the people that can least afford it. Our literature says 8 out of the 12 top producers of pollution are exempt. I'm going to go back, I'm going to give them one. The Centralia plant, okay, it's shutting down in 2025. So let's say 7 out of the top 12 aren't going to be paying this. It's not fair. If you're going to do this, do it to everyone, and let's spread this out and make it less of an impact on everybody. I'd also like to talk about the transportation. For us, the 18th Amendment for Washington State produces funding for transportation infrastructure. In 2015, I was in Olympia. We worked hard for 3 years to get a transportation package to help with new infrastructure we needed. Transportation infrastructure, maintenance, operation, preservation of the infrastructure that we have in place. That funding comes from gas taxes. That's the only place we can get it. We get a small amount from MVET taxes. But the majority of this funding comes from the gas tax. This is going to add 12 to 15 cents to a gallon of gas right out of the gate. From then on, it's 1 to 3 cents every year, and there's no sunset on it. This money will continue to come in every year, and it's going to go up every year. We don't know when it's going to end. They get to evaluate that down the road, but if you got money coming in like they do, $2.3 billion over the first 5 years, you're going to continue to keep that funding coming in. We need that funding. We had the Washington Supreme Court handed down a decision this summer for culverts. We've been working with Senator Hobbs and Senator King, the chair and co-chair of Transportation in Olympia. Going forward, we're going to need possibly 5 to possibly 8 cents to fix this. This is court mandated. It's got to be done. There will be no appetite at all. No appetite to do this when you're adding 12 to 15 cents this year. You're adding 1 to 3 every year after that. We're all not going to stop driving. So to wrap this up, this is going to hurt the economy going down the road statewide. It hurts our members in Washington State building trades members a lot. That's why they didn't come to us and work with us on this. They knew they wouldn't get us on board. Thank you.
Thank you. You now will each have 4 minutes for rebuttal, and we'll begin with Mr. Gary. Your 4 minutes for first rebuttal.
Thank you. The No campaign has a lot of words. It would be polite to call them misrepresentation of the facts. If you've seen the advertising, theirs as well as ours, you know what we feel of much of what they say. We think actions or lack of action is more important than words. The No campaign is almost exclusively funded by the multinational oil companies. And they, as far as I'm concerned, and others agree, have not ever supported anything that had or presented an opportunity to transition away from the fossil fuels and provide consumers with more choices to use clean energy and begin to make this transition away. They call the fee a tax. It is in fact a fee. They call it a tax for obvious reasons. It has a negative connotation at the ballot. But the fact that it's a fee is important. Under Washington state law, fees can only be used for the purpose for which they're enacted. While the legislature will have a great deal of authority during the budget process to determine how this revenue is used, it can only be used for the purpose for which the policy describes, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect jobs, and put people to work. Costs have to be seen in perspective. The oil companies are always trying to get as much as they possibly can at the pump. That's their business model. Maximize profits, generally without regard to consequences. They will try to push as much of this fee as they can to the pump, but they won't be able to push it all. If they push too hard, people begin to make other choices. It's other choices that they don't want us to have an option to make. We have reason to believe from other jurisdictions that they will put some at the pump, but not all. We think the overall effect of the average consumer, again, based upon experience in other countries, as well as the state of California and places like that this will cost the average consumer approximately $10 a month. We think that's a reasonable cost, given the benefit. When you look at all costs, then you look at the benefits, we think it's a reasonable cost. The exemptions that Billy mentioned are there as some of the justice elements, the ethical elements. We do not want to punish coal-fired power plants that are already slated for closure. That includes not just TransAlta in Lewis County, it includes Colstrip 1 and 2 in Montana. We also don't want to force unnecessarily out of the country, or rather out of the state, other industrial manufacturers that are doing their best to survive in a world economy that's working against them. Those are basic commodities manufacturers like aluminum, steel, pulp and paper, glass and concrete. They're already the cleanest, most efficient manufacturers in the world in many cases, and yet they are not able to pass their costs on to their customers as easily as others. And so we want to protect those facilities and those communities that rely on them as much as possible. For that matter, we want to protect our own. We are a fossil fuel community here in Skagit, Whatcom County. We have no intention of running the refining industry out of business. We want them to begin to manage their business in a way that includes more and more clean energy. The impact on transportation funding is an interesting argument. I think most of us know that we can't build enough lanes on the freeway to solve this problem. We must provide other alternatives to avoid cars as much as possible. That's what this is designed to do. Thank you.
Mr. Wallace, your 4-minute first rebuttal, please.
Thank you. Let's start with the actions that Steve brought up. That blatantly false. The laborers and the building trades in general have been working for years on projects. We've been doing windmills. We've been doing solar farms. We're working down at Goldendale on a $3.2 billion storage unit where you pump water up during the day using free electricity from the sun and from solar, and then pump it down at night to satisfy the needs that we have. So for them to say that we haven't been working on this, and here's another one. We worked with Senator Hobbs last year. He was this close to getting a carbon fee. Senator Tim Sheldon, who we all know doesn't know which one he is, a Democrat or a Republican, actually went in and blew it up. The deal was in place. We pushed that. It aggravates me to say that we're not part of this. We have been doing this for years. We've been leading on this. The building trades have been leading on this. So that's very frustrating and misleading for you. I want you people to know that. I talked about the water storage. The tax fee, it is what it is. They're going around it, calling it a fee to get out of the money going towards transportation funding goes to this coalition. This coalition that there's no accountability. It's a 15-person panel eventually that gets to the decisions. There's no way to go after them. If you're mad at Senator Hobbs because he passed a carbon fee, the people in the 44th, which I live in Lake Stevens, I'm one of them, we would vote him out if it didn't work, if he's not doing those things. Absolutely frustrating to hear these come across this way. There will be no appetite. If you want even just the maintenance, operation, and preservation on your roads for the ones that we have, agreed, we'd like to push people out of cars. We're pushing them towards mass transit. On ST3 down in Seattle, nobody put their members' money where their mouth is more than the laborers did. We funded. We got hundreds and hundreds of people every weekend to go out before the last election cycle and hang door hangers, talking about how important ST3 was, so that we can free up room on the interstate and the highways. There'll be no I-3, there'll be no I-7, there'll be no I-403 or 407. We understand that. The cost of that would be astronomical. It won't happen, but we have to keep in place what we have. Montana, we're talking about Washington, folks. This money's coming here. That's the other thing. If they wanted to, and this is a stretch, I'll get it. But if they wanted to buy trees and plant them down in the Amazon, they could do that. And you wouldn't have a damn thing to say about it. We have 300 members up here. For him to work in the industry for 25 years, that's all we're asking. Our members do that. We have up to 300 members during turnaround up here. Most of you that live here know what that's about in the refineries. At a minimum, we have 50 to 100 on the maintenance that goes on in the refineries up here. They're planning for job losses. If they didn't, there wouldn't be a clause in there that they have to keep $50 million in a fund and at that level for job losses. Our members don't want a handout, and this will cover their wage, their full pension and medical care package for up to 5 years. They're planning on job losses. We're already creating green jobs, renewable energy jobs. We're working hard on that. We are trying to get that funding. We have been. Thank you. I'm going to take some water and a breath.
So just so you know what's coming up, you're each going to get 1 minute for rebuttal, for your second rebuttal. And then you will each have the opportunity to ask the other one question, 30-second limit on question asking and 60 seconds on the response. And then you'll have a 3-minute closing statement, followed by audience questions.
Questions from you? Or the audience, or?
Those will be at the end. We're going to finish
Thank
up
you.
your part, and then we'll have the audience questions at the end.
Tim and I question each other all the time when we do this. So.
So, Mr.
We agree on more than you might realize.
We do.
Mr. Gary, your 1 minute second rebuttal, please.
Billy mentioned pump storage. That's a wonderful point of agreement. We would love to build more of that. We need storage so that we can make wind and solar and other renewables more readily available all the time. I was in Goldendale looking at that project just last week. It's a wonderful opportunity. We want to do more of it. There's many chances in Washington State to do similar kinds of work, but we need the revenue to do it, and most of that revenue is not yet available. We need to make it available. The problem with just putting a price on, as Billy talked about in the legislature, is that it comes again without revenue, without effective investment. Economists tell us to make this change, we not only put a higher price on what we don't want, we have to invest in what we do want. That's why the investment, the return of the revenue back is so important. And accountability and oversight has to account for state law. We have no intention of taking the power of the purse away from the legislature. Accountability and oversight committees are just that. It's advice and oversight.
Mr. Wallace, 1 minute for second rebuttal.
I will tell you, we've already been working with Senator King and Senator Hobbs. We're trying another carbon bill. We feel that the way things are going, and I'm a little left of center, okay? We're trying to get a carbon pass this year, a carbon fee passed. We feel that with picking up 2 to 3 seats in the Senate, we're looking at a possibility of 9 in the House. The governor's going to sign this. The governor wants this. The right bill or initiative we would be on board with. So we're pushing already. We're trying to get this legislatively. That way we feel there's more accountability. We can dedicate funding. There's no dedication to funding with this initiative. It's up to the 15-person panel. And are they going to do some good things? Probably. But there's also things that are going to be falling through the cracks. And I'd love to know how many people here today drove or took public transportation to get here. I know it's a beautiful day and I would have walked if I could have. But we all use the roads and we use petroleum unless we've been able to buy an electric car. So thank you.
All right, 30 seconds to ask a question of your opponent, and then the opponent has 60 seconds to respond. Mr. Gary, your question for Mr. Wallace.
More of a statement, but nonetheless, Billy he understands what I'm getting at. One of the things that's been quite frustrating for me and other members of the steering committee that helped develop this policy is the fact that virtually everybody from the building trades to the oil companies were invited to participate in this process. Those that were not participating were because they chose not to participate. The policy has been developed by those who chose to participate. Everyone was invited.
Mr. Wallace, your response?
We were part of it. It's in black and white. Jeff Johnson put out a statement yesterday. We were part of it in the beginning, and we liked what we saw as far as the work conditions, the stipulations are in it. We were on board with that. And then this thing started going sideways. I was part of the Economic Development Transportation Committee for the State Labor Council. The State Labor Council has gone away from labor. They've put social issues first, and so we have walked away. We walked away from this. We were part of it at the beginning, but it went sideways. We can't support this as is. Do we want to do something? Absolutely.
Mr. Wallace, your question for Mr. Gary.
We've already talked about this, but let's do it again.
Okay, let's go.
If this fails, can we get together and work on something again?
Absolutely. The need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels in a manageable, effective, and affordable way does not end. Again, I mentioned the ethics test. I'm going to try to save that for the end. We face an ethics test. We must not fail this test. Absolutely, there'll be room to work.
So you now each have an opportunity to make a 3-minute statement, closing statement, and then after that we will do questions. Mr. Gary, your 3-minute closing statement now, please.
Back to the ethics test. We believe the science is real. We believe the need to address that reality is imperative. What those who tell us that we can't afford to provide clean energy options to consumers right now are ultimately telling us, and understand that the funding is almost exclusively coming from multinational oil companies. What they're telling us essentially is that their profits are more important than our children's best interest, our grandchildren's best interest. That is reprehensible. No well-intentioned and informed voter in Washington State should ever put corporate profits ahead of the best interest of their children and grandchildren. That's the ethical test we have to pass and not fail. I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. Mr. Wallace, your 3-minute closing statement.
I'll repeat. The laborers, LIUNA, International Union of North America, we are not climate deniers. We've been proactive for many years on this. Moving forward, we see the future. We know that it's green. It's got to be renewable. If we could build more dams, we could do that. We're pretty good at that. Laborers and concrete go together like peas and carrots, as far as Gump would say. We can get there. We just feel that we have to protect our members' jobs going forward. This is protecting the economy. The reason why there are Republicans on both sides of this, like Steve and I have talked about this before, on both sides of this, on each side, we are a very dependent state when it comes to the economy, the fruits, the vegetables, everything we grow here in the state, we create in the state, airplanes, everything else, computers. We get it, but we also have to keep our economy moving. We have to keep it going. And right now, a big part of that is shipping stuff over our mountain passes. That's why we put funding into Snoqualmie Pass. We did that because for every hour that pass is shut down, it's between $1.5 million, $2 million an hour that our state loses in business. There's also, like I talked about before, earlier meetings that I've had, we have a bridge that needs to be replaced, 2 of them down in Vancouver. Again, transportation funding. That's $40 million minimum a day if those bridges go down during an earthquake, and we're looking at a $6 billion transportation funding just for that. We've got to protect our members' work. We've also got to keep our economy going. I have 2 kids. The beautiful and lovely Chris Wallace and I have Trey and Kendra. I'm looking out for them too. I want them to be able to be productive and live in the great area. I grew up in Georgia. You probably said, Billy sounds funny. And I grew up in Georgia, but I was born in Snoqualmie, Navy brat. Spent a lot of time down there. Spent a lot of time around good people that I don't agree with on this right now. He'd really be going nuts down there. But I get it. I get it. We have to do something. This is not it. It's poorly written. It's all over the place. It's 4 years, and this is what they came up with, 38 pages. Has everybody here read it? Okay. My point, I'm on number 3. I've done it twice. There's a lot of information in there you need to check out. We're not climate deniers. We want to help. We want to get there. We just don't feel this is it. We're going to try to do this legislatively, and we're working on that. We're close. We can get it done this year. I'm done.
Okay. Questions now. So each of you will have 60 seconds to respond to the question, and both of you will get to respond. The first question is, I'm combining 2. Who are the top polluters that are being exempted from this tax or fee? Why are they exempt, and what impact will the exemption have on the effectiveness of the initiative?
I go first?
Let's have Mr. Wallace go first this time.
Our understanding, Boeing's one of them. I think one of the storage units down in Vancouver is one of them. I have not studied this as much. I'll be up front with you. I know it affects the economy. We have large companies that produce, the aluminum smelters are one of them. We understand we got to keep those jobs in the state. And that's what I was talking about, where we have to take and be fair about this. Spread this out. They're producing carbon. We get it. Maybe you don't hit them as hard to give them incentive to keep them from going anywhere. We want those jobs here. But you can't take this and it be a regressive tax like it is. Like the young lady said before, we are the most regressive tax state in the nation.
Mr. Gary?
The three top emitters that are exempted are the three coal-fired power plants, the one in TransAlta plant in Lewis County and the two, Coal Strip 1 and 2 in Montana. All those plants are slated for closure. They have transition agreements in place that actually protect the community and the workforce there. We do not want to pile on. This is no time to make it more difficult to make this transition effectively. The other major emitters are basic industry like aluminum, pulp and paper, steel, concrete, and the like. The communities that rely upon those jobs should not have to face an unfair or disproportionate burden of this transition. We need to protect those communities because we need the commodities that are produced. There's also exemptions, again, for agricultural fuel, for aviation fuel, as well as that kind of thing, because we have no intention of running industry out of this state.
All right, thank you. Next question. And Mr. Gary, I'll have you go first this time. 1631 provides that there will be appointed a 16-member oversight board. Maybe it's I heard somebody mention 15-member earlier.
Plus the governor.
Oh, okay.
I believe.
Can you speak to how the board members will be appointed, and once appointed, what their responsibilities will be?
Yeah, there's actually the oversight board, then a couple advisory committees. All of those positions are designed to achieve a wide cross-section of constituency across the state, different kinds of communities, different kinds of constituencies that largely reflect the diversity of the organizations that came together to develop the policy. The governor would select many of them, but he has to select from within leadership of some of these organizations. And of course, those leaders would then be accountable to their constituent groups. It's everything from business to labor to environment to social justice groups, faith-based groups, and again, the tribes and all the other organizations. The oversight responsibilities and advisory responsibilities will vary by panel and by which one it is. But they all are responsible for advising the state legislature that controls the power of the purse about how to make investments.
Mr. Wallace, your response?
Well, we would love to know. We haven't heard any names. As far as labor goes, we know that there is generally one position. I don't know what else to tell you on that. They haven't gone into a whole lot of details on that. The governor's going to appoint it. I'm sure there'll be good people. How diverse they're going to be, we don't know yet. Will it be environmentalist heavy? Will it be tribe heavy? We don't know. As far as the tribes go, they were really brought on and worked hard on this because they were going to run their own initiative. It had been a competing initiative, so it would have kind of been splitting the baby a little bit. So going forward, we'll see how that goes. I mean, we'll find out. If this passes, going forward, we'll find out.
All right, next question. What is the difference between a tax and a fee in the context of this initiative? Mr. Wallace?
Our understanding is with the fee, you're able to get around, you can direct that into a funding pot. If it was a tax, because of the 18th Amendment of the state of Washington, it would have to go towards the transportation funding. And that's, like I said, it's one of our biggest peeves for our membership. It's going to be a problem going forward.
Mr. Gary?
As I said earlier, under state law, the fee can only be used for the purposes for which it is enacted. Those purposes are spelled out in the body of the policy. The advisory and oversight committees look at all anticipated investment opportunities, those that are suggested, and make suggestions to the legislature. The power of the purse is not removed from the legislature. Elected representatives through the budgetary process make those choices based upon advice and oversight from the committees. There are more than one labor position on these committees. And they have to come from the diversity, so they can't be loaded to one community or another. We believe that's an effective way to do what's already done in the state during the budgetary process.
Next question. Please explain how the fees affect Washington's meeting of its greenhouse reduction goals. Mr. Gary?
Can you repeat that again?
Please explain how the fees from the initiative affect Washington's ability to meet its greenhouse reduction goals.
The fees have to be used in three primary ways. 70% of the revenue has to be used to make clean energy more readily available or to help us improve energy efficiency, that sort of thing. 25% of the revenue has to be used to protect natural resources like forest lands and water resources from ongoing harm due to climate change. Think drought, flood, wildfire, sea level rise, all that kind of stuff. We need to protect those resources. And 5% is meant for community protection. That includes protection for low-income communities. It means protection for any working people and their communities that may be affected. Those are the primary ways that the revenue is slated to be used.
Wallace?
Well, we'll find out. If you read the initiative, the 38 pages, it's all over the place. You take some of the 10%, you break that down, that gets broken down under the committee. So we'll find out. That's what we're saying. This is poorly written. We don't know. Nothing's set in stone. It's what they're telling us. It's simple as that. We'll find out. We've tried to read this. We've tried to figure out where's it going. Now, they say that they're going to dedicate the 70, the 30, the 20. And again, it goes back to, he just said it, they're planning on job losses. We just don't want it to be our members, and we want to keep our economy healthy. We'll find out where that money's going to be spent. Keep in mind, $2.3 billion over the first 5 years. That's a lot of money for a board that has no accountability, in our opinion.
Okay. How will the collection of 1631 fees, the determination of the credits and exemptions, and other administrative functions be delegated to or among existing or new state agencies? And what is the estimated cost of administering the collection and expenditures of these funds?
You go first?
Mr.
It is
Wallace.
a big one. Oh, you can go.
We've heard it's going to go to water, to clean up the water, and just having a conversation with Senator King and Senator Hobbs this week on Wednesday. Our number one pollution problem is stormwater runoff. That's why the culvert system is being is being pushed so hard. The state agencies, I know that forestry is going to get some for the thinning, so that we don't have the issues we've had with forest fires. That's a great concern for the natural resources. These things used to be taken care of when we used to have pay our taxes, when everybody paid their taxes equally, when large corporations paid them. They used to be taken care of. Now we've got to come in and tax the people that can't be taxed, that shouldn't be taxed, and it's going to be on their backs to go out and take care of these issues. We'll see. The state agencies are going to get some money. They'll make sure of that, I promise.
Gary?
Yeah, I think the question, at least in part, was about administrative fees. There is an allocation for manageable and acceptable minimal administrative fees because a number of different departments of state are going to have roles to play, responsible roles to play. That's the Department of Commerce, Department of Ecology, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Revenue. There are clean energy offices at Washington State University. There's a number of different organizations that will have some responsibility, not just for managing investments and that sort of thing and measuring results, but making sure that they meet the goals of the policy, which again is to be fair, to be effective, to protect jobs as much as possible while creating thousands of new jobs in this state with the highest possible labor standards possible. Those agencies need proper funding, a minimal amount of administrative costs, funding for costs in order to do that job.
I had just one quick thing. If it's administrative fees, it's going to be about $27 million to the state for the first 5 years.
Okay, this is our last question, and I think it's a question that gives you an opportunity to wrap up. This is this initiative hurtful or harmful for our future? Mr. Gary?
As I've said, I think it's an ethics test. Science has been telling us now for 30 or 40 years that we must act, and we must act as soon as possible to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. That doesn't mean the use of petroleum goes away. It doesn't mean that refining goes away. It doesn't have to mean that heavy industry goes away. Some of the places in the world that are much farther ahead than we are some of the most successful industrial countries on earth. Think Germany. Think the Scandinavian countries, a number of them in Europe. There are reasons to believe that we can do this, that we can do it well, we can do it affordably, and we can do it fairly because it is being done in other places. This is Washington State's chance to do the same, to take a meaningful and effective step to a future that guarantees our children's best interests. It is simply irresponsible to put current corporate profits for oil companies ahead of our children's best interests. I think it's an ethics test we can't afford to fail.
Mr. Wallace?
I can agree with him on most of that. We need to get there, and we're doing that. We have been doing that. And he said it himself, make it fair, make it equitable. This initiative does not do that. It's as simple as that. We want to. You know, the European countries, they do a great job, but they tax everybody evenly. And they take that money and they put it towards those projects. Let's do that. Let's get there. Let's make it happen. But let's do it evenly. Let's do it fairly. And don't take it out on the people who can't afford it. In the initiative, there's funding in there for people, low-income people that need help with their fuel bill, need help with their electric bill. And that's great. Most of these people don't know how to get there and do that. I'm glad it's there if this thing passes because they're going to need it. They're going to need it bad.
Thank you. I'd like the audience to join me in thanking Mr. Wallace and Mr. Gary for their time today. And we'll take a short break, very short break.
All right, thank you. Let's reconvene for the last forum of the day. This is Initiative 940, Law Enforcement and Police Training. We'll have 45 minutes for this forum. Annette Holcomb will be our moderator, and she will introduce you to the speakers and explain the rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. The final measure, as Heather announced, is Washington Initiative Measure 940 concerning law enforcement and police training. The ballot will read, Initiative Measure number 940 concerns law enforcement. This measure would require law enforcement to receive violence de-escalation, mental health, and first aid training, and provide first aid and change standards for the use of deadly force, adding a good faith standard and independent investigation. Should this measure be enacted into law, yes or no? In summary, this measure would require all law enforcement officers in the state to receive violence de-escalation and mental health training as developed by the Criminal Justice Training Commission. It would require law enforcement personnel to provide first aid to save lives and require law enforcement agencies to adopt guidelines for implementing this duty. It would amend the standards for justifiable use of deadly force by law enforcement, including adding a good faith standard and requiring independent investigation. Today, our speakers will share their views on whether or not this measure should be approved, and we hope that you will leave with a better understanding of the ballot measure. I would like to introduce Leslie Cushman on your left, who is from De-Escalate Washington, speaking in favor of the proposition. Ms. Cushman is a citizen sponsor of I-940. And Mike Solon, on your right, from the Coalition for Safer Washington, is speaking in opposition. Mr. Solon is a member of the Council of Metropolitan Police and Sheriffs and campaign manager for the Coalition for a Safer Washington. Let me briefly explain the rules and the format that will follow. Each speaker will have 4 minutes for an opening statement and give their best reasons for approving or rejecting the measure. There will be 2 chances each for a rebuttal. Your first rebuttal will be 3 minutes long. Your second rebuttal will be 1 minute. Is it 4 minutes? Excuse me, your first rebuttal will be 4 minutes, the same length as your opening statement. Second rebuttal of 1 minute. And you will have an opportunity to ask 1 question of each other, and then each of you will have a 3-minute closing statement. And then the speakers will respond to questions from the audience. So I encourage you to think about your questions and send them up to us. Our timers, Carol Como and Michelle Kopcha, will signal you with the time. They will hold up a yellow card when you have 15 seconds remaining, and a red sign to signal that time is up. And if one of you continues, a bell will ring to say you have to stop talking right now. We ask that you be respectful of the time allotted so that we can cover as many questions as possible. Those of you in the audience, again, we want to foster a civil discussion of these issues, and to that end, please refrain from audible comments and hold your applause till the end of the session. We encourage you again to send up your written questions, and our ushers are still available to provide a card for you to write down your question. Our screeners will make sure that your questions are legible, that they can be answered by both of our speakers, and that they avoid a duplication with a question that's already been sent up. I will vary the order for the candidates' responses during the forum. And so with that underway, if the timers are ready, Ms. Cushman will go first, and I will rotate from there on. Ms. Cushman, can you begin with your opening statement, please? You have 4 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Leslie Cushman. I'm from Olympia, Washington. I am the citizen sponsor of I-940. I've been working on this issue since mid-2015. Law enforcement and the community both want the same thing: safe communities. I-940 is endorsed and supported by both law enforcement and the community. We have a broad grassroots organization. We are proud to have the Black Law Enforcement Association of Washington and the National Black Police Association as endorsers, as well as King County Sheriff Mitzi Johannick and other law enforcement. We also have the endorsement of the League of Women Voters, the ACLU, Moms Rising, the Children's Alliance, NAMI, Disability Rights Washington, Equal Rights Washington, and many other organizations. Please look at deescalatewa.org to see the extensive list of elected officials, organizations, and party organizations. It's supported by elected officials like former Governor Chris Gregoire, 2-term governor, and 2-term attorney general. This is significant. It's supported by Superintendent of Public Instruction Chris Reichdahl and by U.S. Senator Patty Murray. We are also pleased that Thurston County Prosecuting Attorney John Thunheim has endorsed. John is serving as the president of the Washington Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. All of the 29 tribes in Washington state have endorsed I-940, and we are very proud that the Whatcom Civil Rights Project, Community to Community, and Red Line Salish Sea have endorsed as well. It has local impact here in Whatcom County. Last year, Washington had more deaths from police use of force than 45 other states. We know that the loss of life is devastating for both families and officers. Yes on 940 addresses this by providing officers with greater violence de-escalation and mental health crisis training across Washington for all communities, for all officers. It also provides first aid training for officers and requires first aid at the scene. The focus on prevention and greater training will save lives and is good for the public and for officers. I-940 helps protect people experiencing mental health crises. Up to 1/3 of those killed by police in Washington state have signs of mental illness. Yes on 940 improves mental health training so officers know how to handle difficult situations and keep people with mental illness safe. We all know someone with behavioral health issues. We all might have behavioral health issues. We can see ourselves in that situation. The initiative addresses a gap in our state law by creating an independent investigation process for these tragic instances. I-940 removes the malice clause and defines good faith using an objective standard. I-940 includes a fair process to determine if an officer acted reasonably. This provides a credible and unbiased process that will be transparent and fair for both the officer and the community. The initiative acknowledges the complex situations that law enforcement officers might find themselves in and proposes training to address the impact of bias, stereotypes, and stigmas. It requires training on the role of race in policing. It is very upfront about the issues of economic differences, stigma, and race, and is increasing training to address the impact of those. People with disabilities, people with color, youth, Native Americans, LGBTQ, and people in poverty are sometimes misunderstood in a crisis. The initiative provides modern training to help officers communicate. We appreciate the assistance and support we have received from our law enforcement partners in developing 940 and ask you to join them and us in voting yes on 940.
Thank you. Mr. Solon, your 4-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Leslie, thanks for joining me up here. I want to thank the Women of League of Voters for their invitation to educate the public on how bad Initiative 940 is for public safety. I will agree with Leslie with one thing she just said, is that we in law enforcement are part of the community. We are members of the community. We took an oath to protect and serve. We all want safe communities. However, sadly, Initiative 940 does not provide that safety. And in fact, what it does is divide us more with training that is completely unnecessary. And I'll go into that in a few minutes. I realize that any death in this community or across the state and across the nation at the hands of anybody, let alone law enforcement, is a tragic event. I cannot fathom losing somebody in my family or a loved one or a friend to violence. At the same time, I want to tell you why we should all vote no on I-940. I-940 is not what you think it is. I-940 is controversial, that falsely claims that this is about training. That couldn't be further from the truth. The main goal of 940 is to make it explicitly easier to politically prosecute police officers who sadly have to make those human, dynamic, split-second decisions when we're there trying to protect you. And what the good faith clause is a two-part system within the law itself that the officer must meet. Now, traditionally, when it comes to the prosecutor, they have the burden of proof. Well, now under 940, that burden of proof falls on the law enforcement officer to meet that two-tier system. And if the officer doesn't meet that two-tier system, objective, reasonable, or subjective intent, well, that officer will be stripped of their liberty. Their family will be put in financial ruin, and the oath that they served will be completely thrown away. I-940 is bad policy. With that good faith definition, which is untested, it will lead to officers hesitating before they can effectively make a decision that is a human dynamic, split-second decision to whether or not they're going to want to insert themselves into a dangerous situation for fear of political prosecution. I-940 is completely unfunded. It could cause the taxpayers in this state up to $12 million. The current training we receive from the Criminal Justice Training Commission has already been approved from the taxpayers, everybody in this room. We pay into it. And I can tell you right now, the model that we all go through, that I go through, the Department of Justice recognizes is a national model of crisis intervention and de-escalate training. Officers in RCW 43-101-427 receive 8 hours at the academy level and in-service training per year, plus 2 hours of refresher. And on top of that, they have the ability to attend the 40-hour program with crisis intervention. So think about that. That's a 90% ratio of completion across this state where that is the best training in the nation and recognized as an international model. Please vote no.
Thank you. Ms. Cushman, your rebuttal?
And
4 minutes max. 4 minutes
Four
max.
minutes max. Thank you so much. I want to tell you why a yes note is something you can do with confidence. And I want to remind you that the Black Law Enforcement Association of Washington has been working with us since 2016 and has been endorsing this since 2016. Those are detectives, those are leadership, those are people at the Department of Corrections. They're in his organization, they're in the FOP, they're members of Whatcom, and they've been working closely with us. They wouldn't take this lightly, and they wouldn't ask for your yes vote unless they believed in this. The same with Sheriff Mitzi Johanknick. It's very significant that she has endorsed this. If you go to the TVW Voters Guide, you'll see that she has provided the 3-minute statement for the campaign. She is a leader. She is courageous. The Black Law Enforcement Association of Washington, this is courageous. I don't know if you know what the blue line is or the blue wall, but they have decided it's important to speak up and tell you that this is important for you to vote yes. I want you to know that when we wrote Initiative 940, we based it on best practices from the Department of Justice, best practices from the Police Executive Research Forum, and recommendations from Amnesty International. I'm going to hold up these documents. After Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014, nationally there was a reckoning and a moment to come to grips with it. And we know we're not Baltimore. We know we're not Cleveland. We're not Chicago. We're the West Coast, and we're a little different. We have the Department of Justice in Seattle. We have the Department of Justice in Spokane. We have the Department of Justice in Pasco, and we have the Department of Justice in Portland. We have our own issues we're dealing with. So this is the report put out by the Department of Justice. It's a 21st Century Task Force on Policing. Sue Rahr from the Criminal Justice Training Commission sat on this. That is who's going to handle the rulemaking and the curriculum and the guidelines under the initiative. She was a leader on this, and she's worked on the language that is in this initiative. The language in this is taken from House Bill 1529 and Senate Bill 5073. They came out of a joint task force on the use of deadly force. This is 30 guiding principles on the use of deadly force. It's the Police Executive Research Forum. The #1 principle is sanctity of life. That's why we put into the law that first aid has to be rendered at the scene. Now, I know from working with Mike that he is critical of this aspect. He said it will put officers at risk. That isn't accurate, and if he brings it up, I'll remind him again it's not accurate. The initiative requires that the Criminal Justice Training Commission, which is managed and run by law enforcement, create guidelines to balance the safety of the public and the officer. And it is goofy to think that we would want officers to be at risk. So we're happy about the professional standards in I-940. We're pleased that we have significant law enforcement support, and we know that the training will make a difference. Mike used the phrase political prosecution. I don't know what that means. And in I-940, we set up a process for completely independent investigations, so they'll be credible and unbiased and fair and impartial. There'll be no politics involved at all. You can vote yes on 940 and be confident that it's thoughtful and well-written. And you can be confident that law enforcement supports it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Solon. Your
Yes.
rebuttal?
Thank you. I can tell you that facts matter. Context matters. And when you delve into each individual tragic death, I think if people really understood each one that is deemed controversial, people would have a different opinion on how those shook out. When I talk about good faith argument and how detrimental that is to law enforcement in this state, and I'm referring to 940's good faith definition, which is atrocious. The good faith argument is that When an officer has to make that split-second decision in the middle of the night in an alley where they're in fear of their life or they have to protect someone who's in fear of their life, if they make a human mistake in that blink of an eye, imagine in 2020 hindsight, days, weeks, months later, in fact, maybe even years, if there is somebody who is a paid expert witness that says, you know what, I wasn't there that day, I wasn't in the cold, it wasn't wet, but I'm here to tell you that that officer's actions were unreasonable. Therein lies for us that unreasonable definition of good faith in 940 that should concern us all. That will lead to officers hesitating because that will open the door for political prosecutions based upon an incident she just brought up in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, the Michael Brown tragic death. And if you look at that incident and you really understood it, the Department of Justice recognized that the officer's actions were justified. And if you look at the facts, so therein lies the political prosecution. If 940 was put in this state, it would just take one person to make an officer suffer and have their liberty taken away and stripped from their families. And that is not okay by us. I don't think it should be okay by anybody in the communities that we serve. For de-escalation to work, and I've been through the training, and the training is top-notch, as I mentioned. It's a national model. It takes two people for de-escalation to work. I can have all the training in the world, and I'm a proponent of training. I put on training across the state. I travel the nation to participate in training. The bottom line is that if you have somebody that you're contacting and they have a mindset either to hurt you, hurt somebody else, or force the officer to end their life, no amount of training can change that mindset. And so the ownership that is solely put on the police officers is not okay. And that this is what 940 calls for. To put the onus completely on the officer's actions. Where is the culpability with the individuals that we contact? As tragic as that incident might occur, where is their ownership? Because the reality is that they have a say when it comes to how the interaction plays out. Is this going to be a positive outcome? I-940 will have an indeterminate amount of state revenue impact. It does not specify whether local governments or the state should pay for the training. And I can tell you under Washington Administrative Code 13905-300, that code states that all certified peace officers must receive continued education and training. And I can tell you right now, and I'll share this document if you need it, Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission breaks the CIT training down to the amount of officers already receiving this. This is what we're talking about. This training already exists.
Time is up. You have a second rebuttal, and Ms. Cushman, I'm going to ask you to go first with your second rebuttal, just 1 minute in length.
Thank you. I want to talk about the funding issue. First, initiatives can't include funding, so that's sort of a red herring. This past year, the legislature appropriated $970,000 for the first year of this initiative. They're all ready to go. And they already have appropriated an additional $1 million for the mental health training. So, and they've made a complete commitment to keep the funding coming. So funding is not going to be a problem. I also want to talk about this narrative that Mike just offered about it takes two people to de-escalate. That just sounds like blame the victim to me. Please vote yes on 940.
You know, law enforcement officers, as I stated earlier, are members of this community. We took an oath.
Sir, you don't have another rebuttal
I'm sorry.
at this time. This was, oh yes you do. You sure do, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Do I get to restart the clock?
No, yeah, start again. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
thank you. You know, I'm a human being. Law enforcement officers that protect you and protect these communities are human beings. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I have 2 young daughters. I took an oath to protect the people whether it's daytime, nighttime, regardless of their ethnicity, their race, their political wishes. I find on I-940 a complete assault on every officer in this state. And that's why we take such a hard line of approach, that this is not about training. We already received the best training in the nation, in the world, and you already pay for it. Please vote no on 940 and protect your communities and understand how awful 940 is.
All right. Thank you. And next, you will each have an opportunity to ask a question of the other. I'm going to ask Mr. Solon for you to ask the first question. Please make it a question and limit it to 30 seconds, and your response will be limited to 1 minute, Ms. Cushman. So, Mr. Solon, your question.
My question to Leslie would be, please explain, within the Initiative 940, it's defined as the paramount duty of an officer to render first aid before they have to take action against somebody who is possibly shooting somebody. Please explain to me how an officer must protect and give first aid to people before they apprehend a shooter, which 940 calls for.
So the initiative has this language. It says that the Criminal Justice Training Commission, in consultation with the Washington State Patrol, the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, organizations representing state and local law enforcement officers and health providers, have to develop guidelines for the duty to implement first aid. The guidelines must balance competing public health and safety duties. They do not require the officer to provide first aid before it addresses a fallen officer or member of the public. That is inaccurate. Please vote yes on 940.
Cushman, your question directed to Mr. Solon now.
I don't have a question for Mike. Thank you very much.
You pass.
I pass.
Okay. So then we'll move ahead to a closing statement. Ms. Cushman, you will be first with the closing statement, limited to 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. No matter our differences, all of us want to ensure our families, communities, and law enforcement are safe. Initiative 940 will help save lives by improving de-escalation and mental health crisis training for all law enforcement officers. I-940 ensures that law enforcement has the training and tools they need. Many in law enforcement, including current and retired sheriffs and police chiefs, as well as the Black Law Enforcement Association of Washington, support this measure because more training is critical to prevent tense situations from becoming tragedies. Right now, there is no statewide minimum requirement for de-escalation training and only 8 hours of crisis intervention training required. Yes on 940 would provide all law enforcement officers in Washington with enhanced de-escalation, mental health crisis, and first aid training, so officers are better prepared to handle challenging situations. Initiative 940 will save lives, particularly the most vulnerable members of our communities. Today, more Washingtonians are killed in encounters with law enforcement than in 45 other states. Up to 1/3 of those killed showed signs of a mental health crisis. We can do better. We all believe that no family should have to live through losing a loved one in an avoidable tragedy. You know, I forgot to mention that my grandfather was the Olympia police chief for a number of years. We in my family have a special place for the safety of officers. He was also a Thurston County deputy sheriff. I am not a law enforcement officer and have never served in that capacity, but it's been our family tradition to uphold it and honor it. I have a cousin who is a state patrol officer, and I have many members of my family who are in law enforcement. So I'm not unfamiliar with the pressures and tragedies that can face law enforcement. We're very sensitive to it, and I am proud that law enforcement are working alongside with De-Escalate for the good policies that it has. Initiative 940 will create a new, fair, and independent process after the use of deadly force. After a tragedy occurs, families, communities, and law enforcement need to understand what happened and why. Yes, on 940 will establish an impartial process to determine whether an officer's use of deadly force was necessary, as well as what could have been done to prevent tragic outcomes in the future. You might not know this, as we haven't mentioned it, but since 1986, when our new law was put into place, there's been no officers convicted of excessive use of force. And we don't want that to change. We don't want officers to be put in jail. That's why we're promoting training to save lives. Thank you.
Solon, your 3-minute closing statement, please.
I mentioned earlier, I'm a police officer. I've been a police officer for 20 years. I have family that are police officers. My friends are police officers. It's been in my family's blood for decades. No officer that I know of, nor whom I want to know, would ever want to take somebody's life. We took an oath to save lives. I will put my life on the line to protect you. 940 would prohibit me from having the adequate legal confidence to make those split-second decisions in the middle of the night or even in the middle of the day to protect you. It will cause officers to hesitate based on how this deadly force language is written. You know, if you look at statistics, I mentioned facts matter. Context matters. 2015 FBI crime stats, in particular Table 43. The risk of being killed by police is lower than you can probably imagine. It's about 0.01% during any arrest across the nation. In fact, in 2015, there were 8,248,709 arrests made by the police across the nation. That's one person out of 8,516 cases that has a use of force confrontation with the police. That's 0.01%. So the notion that we are intentionally and proactively taking people's lives is an insult to our profession, an insult to our communities. This is why 940 is dangerous policy. If the community is asking for the restructure of the deadly force language as it currently exists, in particular the term malice, I have no problem sitting down in Olympia with members of the community across this state to remove malice. The fact is, we don't need it. What's important, if we're talking about reform, and the community should hold the police accountable, we are beholden to you. But please understand that the reform doesn't get done with this initiative. The reform needs to be done that is sensible reform. Sensible reform where good faith is reasonably defined to protect the officers who go to protect you. And if society confers on a qualified human being to have the authority to take someone's life in his or her job, shouldn't the benchmark for prosecution be high to give us the confidence that we can adequately protect you? Please vote no.
Okay, we're now ready for some questions, and I will ask the question alternating. Who will respond first? Your responses should be limited to 1 minute, please. Okay, the first question, Ms. Cushman, you will respond first. Do you believe that voting for this initiative can be interpreted as a vote against our law enforcement officers and their work? Explain your position.
I do not think so, and it's because of the strong partnership we have with law enforcement on this issue. I will remind you, as I've mentioned before, that Sheriff Mitzi Johanknick, who has 34 years in policing, she's been a detective, she's administered a precinct, she's done a SWAT team, she's done community policing, and now she's the elected sheriff of King County. She has stepped out to support this. This is about coming together. This is about courage. This is about taking the next step for reform. The Black Law Enforcement Association of Washington, They are our partners, Norm Stamper, Jim Pugel, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. So we are not dividing the community. This is not controversial. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, your response?
My response is no officer that works the street that is in contact with the members of all of our communities across this state that are represented with labor organizations support 940. The people that Leslie says supports 940 are elected officials and a handful of people. The bottom line is the people that contact you on the street do not support 940. Those are the people that matter, that have contact with people that are in crisis. Those are the individuals that receive the training I've already mentioned to you. And I will give you statistics on this training. This is from the Criminal Justice Training Commission's website. As of May 25th, 2018, there have been 2,070 officers across the state that have completed the 40-hour training, which is voluntary. I'm told that number is 3,000 now. Think about thank you, please vote no.
So, Mr. Sullivan, the question was, do you believe that voting for this initiative can be interpreted as a vote against our law enforcement officers for their work? It's just quick yes or no.
Thank you for the reminder. Yes, I firmly believe
That's your belief.
that this is an anti-community, anti-police measure that wants to put officers in jail for making human split-second decisions, and that is not fair.
Okay, the next question is concerning training. What is the difference between the existing required training and that proposed in Initiative 940? Are topics such as inherent racial bias included in both of these?
Well, I can tell you that the training that I receive in the agency that I represent, I mean, I can't speak for that agency, obviously, but I receive that training all the time. No officer that I know that's had the background check, the polygraph examination, the psychological evaluation, the physical training regimens so we have to prove that we're worthy of employment to protect the citizens, have that mindset of being biased or want to act with ill intent. The difference right here is that I mentioned as of May 25th, 2018, 2,070 officers across the state have completed the 40-hour course. CJTC is partnering with 8 regional programs to complete 12 of the 40-hour classes. Think about that. That is top-notch training that you, the taxpayer, pays millions of dollars already for. 940 causes for $12 million more dollars.
It sounds like time is up. Would you like me to repeat the question? Or?
Yeah, and also repeat how much time I have.
You have a 1-minute response.
Thank you.
The question is, what is the difference between existing required training and that proposed in I-940? Are topics such as inherent racial bias included in both of these?
Right now, there is no state law requirement for de-escalation training. When 940 is enacted, so I mean state law requirement, it might be happening, but it's not required. We think it should be a priority and be emphasized. Included in 940 is a requirement for implicit and explicit bias, cultural competency, and the historical intersection of race and policing. We also are addressing bias and stigma related to mental health and training on respect for persons from different backgrounds. Cultural competency is a big piece of Initiative 940. We're also requiring alternatives to jail booking, alternative to lethal weapons, and patrol tactics and interpersonal communication training to avoid escalating situations that lead to violence. Thank you.
Okay. The next question will be Ms. Cushman's, your opportunity to answer first, and it's a follow-up on the nature of the training. Is the current training, in your understanding, a voluntary training, so local community officers can choose to skip it? And does this initiative require the training?
This initiative will set new standards for training. Right now, officers do take some violence de-escalation training and 8 hours of crisis intervention training, but it is not this modern curriculum that is reflected in the best practices. So I actually want to talk about the notion that these black law enforcement officers are not real officers and are not on the street. They're not here today to tell you, but they wear uniforms, they carry guns. Detective Cookie is out in the community every day. So please don't dismiss them based on the manner of their race or their association with the initiative. They are substantial, significant, and deserve to be respected, and that their endorsement is significant, and we honor it and are grateful for it. Thank you.
Dolan, your response is regarding voluntary training. Are the local community officers given this training on a voluntary basis? Can they choose to get the training, or is it required? And why should this training not be required?
I first want to clarify, this initiative isn't about race, not in the slightest. I work with African Americans on a daily basis who are part of my membership, and they take great umbrage to those talking points that you just put out. The bottom line is that there already is a current law passed in 2014 that taxpayers pay millions of dollars into to give us crisis intervention training across the state. And I'll read it to you. This is from the Criminal Justice Training Commission's website. The Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission provides crisis intervention training through multiple programs and grants that meet RCW 43-101-427. It mandates that officers must receive this training across the state. There's a 90% compliance that is improving as we speak. Plus, on top of the 40-hour program that officers can participate in, and I'm telling you, there is so much interest in that program, that's why it's the national model.
Okay, thank you. The next question is concerning malice. Under the current law, malice is a required element improving guilt. Can you please define malice? This comes into play when an officer uses force, deadly force. In your view, is malice the appropriate standard when evaluating whether a police use of deadly force was justified? Why or why not?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, law enforcement doesn't need malice. I spoke with the author of the current deadly force language that we're all operating under, and the reality is we don't need malice. Malice is a state of mind. You cannot prove state of mind. What matters, and this should matter for us all, is that good faith is reasonably defined. So when officers that have to make those split-second decisions feel comfortable with confidence that they can go into your home, and God forbid they have to take a life, that months later, whether protecting you or stopping at a violent assault, that they can rest assured that they have the proper legal protections to protect you or protect one of your loved ones. 940 doesn't get this done. It creates more division.
Ms. Cushman, your response?
Please repeat the question.
Yes. Under current law, malice is a required element improving guilt when an officer uses deadly force. Define malice, and in your view, is malice the appropriate standard when evaluating police's use of deadly force, whether it is justified?
So yes, malice is in the existing statute, and I-940 removes malice. And additionally, good faith is in the existing statute, and I-940 adds a definition of it to give more clarity to it. And King County Prosecutor Dan Satterberg has called the malice standard a de facto immunity. Since the law changed in 1986 to reflect a U.S. Supreme Court case regarding fleeing felons and necessity And what the Supreme Court said is you don't have to pursue every suspect. So the malice clause is unnecessary, and the good faith standard in I-940 is a good standard and endorsed by by Thurston County Prosecuting Attorney John Thunheim, who's the president of the Washington Association of Prosecuting Attorneys.
Okay, thank you. And this is the last question that we have time for. It's
I'll go.
You were first, Ms. Cushman, you are the first one to respond to this. There were several cases of deadly police action in the national spotlight recently. In your view, has media coverage of these cases influenced opinions about this initiative? Please explain and cite any cases that have influenced you personally.
What has influenced me personally is what happened in Thurston County in May of 2015. 2 young men were shot, but black men, but they weren't killed. And the Olympia Police Department had a task force on the use of deadly force. And what came to light for me was from a Seattle Times investigative report in September of 2015 around the malice clause. And I began working on this with a coalition in Olympia called the Olympia Coalition to Reform Deadly Force Laws. And we formed a grassroots group and went to the legislature in 2016. And now we're here with Initiative 940. So I think for me, it's the local cases that have affected me personally, not the national cases. Thank you.
Would you mind repeating the question, please?
Not at all. Several cases of deadly police action have been in the national spotlight. In your view, has media coverage of these cases influenced opinions about this initiative?
Absolutely they have.
And please explain which cases and cite any case that influenced you personally.
Well, Leslie already spoke of the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri. If people really understood the facts of that case and how media influencing the populace across the nation, and I think due to 940, the facts are the Department of Justice recognized that shooting as completely justified. So did a grand jury in that state. And she mentions the Seattle Times and other tragic incidents in this state. I want to remind everybody that facts and context matter. And so if you look at each individual case, the entirety of every detail within those incidents, you'll notice that all of them were justified, investigated by judges, prosecutors, and in some cases, majority of them, by civilians. You. The officers were justified.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid this signal that our time is up. I appreciate both of you coming today to help us better understand what's going to be before us on the ballot. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
So quickly to thank everybody who helps to put these forums on. This is a ton of work for league members, but we also really appreciate the audience participation in helping formulate these very thoughtful questions. So thank you to all of our speakers, and I think particularly to our high school debate team members. This is the first time they've done this, and we hope that we'll see them back again because they were very informative and thorough. Thank you so much to the voter services team, everyone who put this on. Helen Campbell standing at the back is our voter services chair, but the timers, the question screeners, the ushers, the question committee who puts together the league's questions have been working behind the scenes for several months. In fact, we start planning these forums in May of each year. Thank you to our co-sponsor, the City of Bellingham, and our media partner, the Bellingham Herald, and particularly for the team doing the video recording here from the city. Just to remind you that the forums are the property of the City of Bellingham and the League of Women Voters of Bellingham, Whatcom County, so they may not be used without permission.